I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful solo hike up to the summit of Blue Ridge, a trail I had done countless times before. Nothing too challenging, just a nice day to clear my head and get away from the noise of daily life. But as I set foot on that well-worn path that morning, I had no idea how wrong everything would go. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the forest floor as I began my hike. The air was cool but not cold, and the trees whispered gently with the wind. I adjusted the straps of my backpack, which was light enough, holding just a few essentials: water, snacks, my first aid kit, and a jacket in case the weather turned. I always like to be prepared, even for a short hike like this one. I had done this trail before many times actually. It was familiar, a path that didn't require a lot of thought. Just a pleasant walk through the woods, a steady climb, and then the rewarding view at the top. It was perfect for when I needed to get away and recharge. The forest felt alive that morning. Birds were singing, the wind was rustling the leaves, and occasionally, I could hear the distant sound of a stream. I took it slow, not rushing, enjoying the peace. The smell of pine was thick in the air, and I felt myself starting to relax, the weight of the world slowly lifting. I had been on the trail for maybe 2 hours when things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, a feeling almost like I wasn't alone. I glanced around a few times, but the forest was still. There was no one else in sight, not a soul. It wasn't busy that day. I wasn't expecting to run into anyone, but as I continued on, the hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle. The air felt colder, though the temperature hadn't dropped. My steps seemed louder now, echoing in my own ears, and it felt as if the trees were leaning in closer, watching me. I paused for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired or too focused on the trail. The more I thought about it, though, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I pushed on, trying to keep my mind occupied. The path began to narrow, the trees pressing in closer. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind seemed to have died down. I could hear nothing but the soft crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional snap of a twig from deeper in the woods. I looked around. There was nothing unusual about the landscape, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. I had hiked this trail before, but this time it felt different. The forest felt oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. At that point, I decided I would turn around. It wasn't that I was scared exactly, but I didn't want to take any chances. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. My instincts were telling me something wasn't right. So I started heading back, retracing my steps down the trail. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The path seemed longer than it had been on the way up. The trees, the rocks, the markings along the trail, they all looked unfamiliar. I knew I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but everything felt out of place. Even the sounds of the forest had changed. I could hear a low, distant hum now, like the wind was carrying something just beyond my reach. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else. A hum that seemed too steady, too mechanical. I stopped again, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing, just the forest, quiet and still. I shook my head and continued, but the further I went, the stranger it became. It was as if the trail was shifting, bending in ways I didn't remember. The trees had grown denser, their trunks thicker, and the path narrower. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be there, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence. It wasn't until I reached the clearing near the bottom of the trail that I realized how disoriented I had become. The sun was higher now, and the shadows of the trees were stretching long across the ground. But the clearing I had just reached didn't feel right. The clearing was supposed to be a place where the trail opened up, where I could sit and rest, but now it felt wrong. The edges of the clearing seemed to fade into the trees unnaturally, like there were parts of the forest that didn't belong. I couldn't explain it, but something about it made my stomach twist. I knew I had to get out of there, but as I turned to leave, I heard it again. That hum. This time it was closer, louder. It sounded almost like a drone, like machinery working just out of sight. My heart started to race. I started walking faster, trying to keep calm. But no matter how quickly I moved, the hum seemed to follow me. It was as if the very forest itself was shifting around me, closing in. I don't know how long I had been walking at that point, but I found myself back at the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, which was odd for a Saturday afternoon. I had expected at least a few cars, but there was nothing, just the stillness. I was finally back at my car, breathing heavily, my pulse racing. I threw my pack in the back seat and slammed the door shut. As I sat there for a moment, trying to collect myself, I realized something terrifying. The hum had stopped, but there was still that feeling, like someone was watching me from the trees. I started the car and sped out of the parking lot, not looking back. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was following me, that the hum was still out there, waiting, watching. By the time I reached the highway, the unsettling feeling began to fade. I was on familiar roads again, the city lights casting a false sense of comfort. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the memory of the hum. It haunts me. I keep wondering if there was something out there, something I wasn't meant to see. And I wonder, deep down, if the forest will ever stop watching me. I decided to take a solo hiking trip in early September. I had been dealing with a lot of stress from work and life in general, and I just needed a break. I wanted to go somewhere remote, away from people, noise, and cell phone reception. After looking through some hiking forums and checking maps, I found a long backcountry trail in northern Idaho that didn't seem too popular. It was about 25 miles long and looped through the forest, crossing a couple of streams and gaining a fair amount of elevation. The trail started at a small gravel parking area off a logging road. There was no official sign, just a worn wooden marker nailed to a tree. I packed up all the usual things: my tent, a sleeping bag, a bare canister full of food, a small stove, water filter, extra socks, a map, compass, and a satellite GPS just in case. I had hiked alone before, so I wasn't too nervous. I had done my homework, told a friend where I was going, and gave myself 4 days to finish the loop. The weather looked clear with no storms in the forecast. I drove out early in the morning, bouncing over potholes and rocks until I reached the parking area. My car was the only one there. I locked it up, threw on my pack, and headed into the trees. The trail was quiet, covered in pine needles and scattered branches. The air smelled sharp and clean. It felt good to be out there. I followed the trail as it slowly climbed through the forest. Every now and then, I passed an old blaze on a tree, but the path was mostly obvious. By mid-afternoon, I had gone about 8 miles and stopped near a creek to set up camp. I found a flat area under some pines, close enough to the water to filter but far enough to stay dry. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and spent the evening listening to birds and the faint sound of the stream. I didn't see anyone all day. It was peaceful. That night, I slept well. I woke up once to pee, but everything was still and quiet. The next morning, I packed up and kept moving. The trail got steeper and rockier as I went. I started seeing old signs of logging, rusted cables, cut stumps, and narrow skid trails now overgrown with moss. I stopped to take pictures and drink water. It was slow going, but nothing too hard. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The trail began to fade. I hadn't seen a blaze in a while, and the dirt path under my boots looked thinner. I checked my map and compass and figured I was still heading in the right direction. The GPS showed I was close to where the trail curved to the north, so I kept going. But the more I walked, the more unsure I felt. The ground got softer, almost spongy in places, and the trees were thicker, their branches tangled. I found a downed tree and sat to recheck my location. The GPS wouldn't lock on, just a spinning wheel. I turned it off and on again. Nothing. I pulled out my map and tried to match the terrain. I thought I was close to the next creek crossing, but I couldn't hear water anywhere. I decided to backtrack a little and see if I missed a turn. I walked for half an hour in the direction I came from, but everything started to look the same. Trees, roots, more trees. I didn't recognize the downed logs or rocks. felt like the forest had shifted around me. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was on edge. I took a deep breath and told myself to stay calm. I had enough food and water. I knew how to use a compass. I picked a direction that matched the trail's original heading and walked slowly, marking trees with a small blade so I wouldn't go in circles. The ground was uneven, and I had to climb over logs and push through thick brush. By late afternoon, I still hadn't found the trail again. I stumbled into a low area that smelled musty and damp. There were strange, muddy patches and little pools of still water. I didn't like the look of it, so I skirted around the edge and found a dry ridge to climb. From the top, I thought I saw a faint line through the trees, like a path. I pushed toward it. What I found wasn't the trail. It was a narrow game trail, packed dirt and deer prints, winding through dense brush. I followed it anyway, hoping it would lead to a clearer area. After another hour, the sun started to dip, and I had to think about shelter. I set up camp on a flat spot near the base of a hill. It wasn't ideal, but I needed rest. That night was different. Couldn't relax. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something shifting in the brush. I told myself it was deer or small animals. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up, heart racing, listening hard. Nothing came close, but the forest felt wrong. Too quiet between the sounds, like it was waiting. In the morning, I packed up fast. I was sore and tired, but I had to keep moving. I ate a protein bar and started walking again. The compass said I was heading east, so I kept pushing that way. The game trail had faded, and I was walking cross-country, using hills and sun position to guide me. I slipped a few times on wet leaves and rocks. My clothes were damp with sweat, and mosquitoes kept landing on my neck and arms. Sometime after noon, I found a broken wooden post sticking out of the ground. It looked like an old trail marker. The paint was gone, but the shape was right. I followed that direction, and after half an hour, I saw something that made me almost cry. A footbridge. It was old and narrow, but it crossed a stream and had handrails. Real trail work. I hurried across and found the main trail again, clear as day. I checked the GPS, still nothing. But the compass matched the trail, and I felt a surge of relief. I followed the path until I found a small clearing and dropped my pack. I ate, drank, and just sat there breathing. I was back on track. I hiked another few miles that afternoon and set up camp early. The next morning, I finished the loop and made it back to my car. It was dirty but untouched. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, just resting. That trip shook me more than I expected. I didn't get hurt, and I never saw another person, but the feeling of being lost, truly lost, in that thick forest stuck with me. It reminded me how easy it is to step off a trail and vanish. I was lucky. I had enough skill and gear to get out, but I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd gone one ridge too far or gotten hurt. Now, when I hike, I pay closer attention. I mark my location more often. I trust my instincts when something feels off. And I never forget how fast the woods can turn quiet and strange when you're alone and unsure of the way out. I had been planning that hiking trip for months. I needed a break from the noise, from people, from screens, from everything. It had been a rough year. Work was taking a toll on me. My back hurt constantly from sitting too long, and my head always buzzed from endless notifications. I needed to get out, be alone, breathe actual air, and hear nothing but nature. I picked a remote trail in northern Colorado, far from the popular routes. I found it on a hiking forum, buried deep in an old thread. It was called the Lost Knife Ridge Trail. Some guy posted about it years ago, said it was underused and overgrown but still passable. He warned that parts were rough and hard to follow, but that's what made it beautiful. That's exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no signs, no rules. Just me, the trees, and the sky. I parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off by the forest line. There were no trail signs, just a faint path leading into thick woods. I had my gear packed tight. Tent, food for 5 days, water filter, first aid, and backup batteries. My phone had a GPS app, but I didn't expect reception past the first few miles. The first day felt perfect. cool mountain air, dry leaves crunching under my boots, birds calling in the distance. I followed the narrow trail, ducking under branches and stepping over fallen trees. The deeper I went, the more the world faded away. The trail was real, but clearly forgotten. Sometimes it split or disappeared, but I used a downloaded topographic map to find my way back each time. By early evening, I found a clearing beside a cold creek and set up camp. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and laid in my tent watching the trees sway above me. I felt good, really good. I didn't think about work, my bills, or any of the stress I left behind. Out here, none of that mattered. The second day, I hiked deeper along a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. The trail was barely there, more like a suggestion than a path. At one point, I missed a turn and wandered too far uphill. I had to backtrack by checking my position against the topographic lines. It took almost an hour to find the right way again. I reminded myself to be more careful, but even then, it didn't feel dangerous. Just a minor setback. That night, I camped on flatter ground, but I noticed the forest around me felt thicker. Not in a spooky way, just denser. The trees grew closer together. The light barely reached the forest floor. The silence was deep, not broken by any distant highway or plane overhead. It was pure quiet. At one point in the night, I woke up sweating, even though it was cold outside. I must have zipped the sleeping bag too tight. I unzipped it, cooled off, and fell back asleep to the sound of the wind through the branches. The third day, things started to change. The morning was fine. I filtered water from the creek and followed the trail along a rock face. But late in the afternoon, I took a wrong turn. I know I did. I can't say exactly where, but somewhere near a sharp descent past a group of dead pine trees, I veered off. I didn't realize it until maybe an hour later, when the trail vanished completely. I was standing on loose ground, leaves and rocks sliding under my boots. No sign of a worn path anywhere. I pulled out the GPS app, but there was no signal. I tried the map, but the terrain didn't quite match anymore. I zoomed in, turned the phone every way, but the features on the screen didn't line up with what I saw. No creek, no ridge, just thick woods and a steep drop behind me. I thought maybe if I backtracked, I'd find the trail again. I walked for an hour, maybe two, but nothing looked familiar. Everything started to look the same. Trees, rocks, moss, roots. Every hill looked like the one before it. I started to sweat hard, even though the air was cool. I forced myself to stay calm, kept my breathing slow. I still had plenty of daylight left. I'd find my way, but I didn't. That night, I set up camp in a hurry. I picked a dry spot under thick trees and built a fire with some twigs and a fire starter block. I ate quickly and stared into the flames. My thoughts began to unravel. I knew the basics: if lost, stay in one place and conserve energy. But part of me still thought I'd stumble onto the trail again in the morning. The forest that night felt different. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt thick, like it was pressing in. I kept hearing tiny sounds, branches snapping, leaves shifting, soft steps. I told myself it was animals, probably deer or rabbits, but I never saw anything. I barely slept. Every sound woke me. I kept the fire going longer than usual, adding sticks every time it got low. In the morning, I tried to use the compass. I figured if I kept moving west, I'd eventually hit a road or at least some familiar landmark. The trouble was, west was all uphill and covered in thick brush. Every 100 feet felt like a mile. My pack got heavier with every step. Sweat poured down my back, and I slipped more than once. By late afternoon, I started seeing things that made my stomach twist. My own boot prints. At first I thought it was coincidence, maybe from turning slightly, but I saw more. I had looped back again. The forest was folding in on itself. No matter how carefully I walked, I always came back to something I'd seen before. A rotten log, a 3-trunk tree, a boulder shaped like a skull. I was walking in circles. I sat down hard and just stared at the ground. My legs ached. My feet throbbed. My hands were scratched from pushing through thorns. I wasn't bleeding, but I was starting to panic. I checked my phone again. No signal. That night it rained. Not hard, but steady. I rushed to set up the tarp over my tent. The ground turned soft and soaked through my socks. I huddled inside the tent, wet, cold, and wide awake. My stomach grumbled, but I couldn't eat. I felt sick, like the forest itself was pressing on me. On the 5th day, I changed direction again. I figured east might be better. I passed a dry creek bed and followed it downhill for a while. It was hard walking, loose rocks, fallen limbs, but it at least moved me in a straight line. I walked for hours, feet screaming, neck stiff, shoulders raw under the pack. Then I slipped. I was stepping over a wet rock when my foot shot out and I landed hard on my side. My ribs took the worst of it. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. When I sat up, pain shot through my chest like a knife. I tested my arms, legs, nothing broken, but deep bruising, maybe a cracked rib. I forced myself to stand. I kept moving, but slower. Each step sent a dull thud through my chest. The sun passed overhead. Shadows grew long. My thoughts got dark again. What if no one ever finds me? What if I go to sleep and don't wake up? That night, I didn't bother with a tent. I just lay under the tarp and stared at the sky through the trees. I saw stars, but they felt fake. Too far away. Too unreachable. I felt like a speck under glass. Alone in a museum where no one ever walked by. On day 6, I found something. It wasn't salvation, but it changed things. I found a fence. Just wire and wooden posts, weathered and half-fallen. But it was man-made. It meant someone had been here, maybe still was. I followed it. It ran crooked through the trees, sometimes broken, sometimes overgrown. But I stayed with it all day. Late in the afternoon, I saw the roof of a small structure through the trees. It was an old ranger station or maybe a hunting cabin. One window was boarded, the other broken. The door was cracked open. Inside was dusty, full of spiderwebs, but dry. There was a metal stove, a rotted mattress, and an old wooden chair. No food, no maps, no tools, but shelter. I stayed there that night. For the first time in days, I felt a bit safer. I still heard noises outside, scraping, crunching, but I locked the door with a rope from my pack. I ate slowly, rationing the last of my bars and jerky. In the morning, I climbed the highest ridge I could find behind the cabin. I left my pack below and scrambled to the top. The climb took an hour, but when I got there, I saw it, civilization. Not close, but in the far distance, I saw a tower, a fire watchtower or cell tower, rising over the trees, maybe 3 or 4 miles away. It was all I needed. I rushed back, grabbed my gear, and headed straight toward it. No trail, no markers, just a line in my head and a promise. Took all day. The terrain was brutal. Hills, creeks, thorns, brush. I tore my clothes, twisted my ankle, and stumbled more times than I can count. But I made it. I reached the tower just before dark. No one was there, but there was a service road beside it. And best of all, my phone picked up a signal. 1 bar, but enough. I sent out my coordinates and an emergency ping. 2 hours later, a ranger found me sitting under the tower, wrapped in my tarp and shaking. I was 24 miles off course. I spent the night in a It started as a simple hiking trip, something I'd planned out during a quiet week at work. I'd been going through a rough time, just tired of the noise of everyday life, people asking me questions, dealing with phones ringing and emails piling up. I needed to unplug, get out into the woods, be alone, breathe for a bit. I decided to hike through a section of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It wasn't far from where I lived, and it had the kind of rough, old, wild terrain that I liked. Remote enough that I wouldn't be running into crowds, but not so far out that I'd need more than a weekend's worth of supplies. I packed light but enough to get by. My old internal frame backpack, a 1-person tent, sleeping bag, water filtration kit, dried food, matches, my knife, headlamp, a few layers of clothes, and a topographic map I'd printed off the Park Service website. I also brought a power bank for my phone, but turned the thing off before I even got to the trailhead. The plan was to be out for 2 nights. I parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off by the start of an unmaintained side trail that looped deep into the forest and eventually connected to a more popular trail about 10 miles in. I'd read some reports that parts of the old trail were overgrown and hard to follow, but that didn't bother me. I liked the challenge, and I knew how to handle a compass and read terrain. The first day was peaceful. The trail was quiet, covered in soft pine needles and dead leaves. The early fall air was dry and cool. Yellow light filtered through the thinning leaves overhead. I walked for miles without seeing anyone, just birds flitting around and the occasional squirrel. I stopped by a creek for lunch, filled up my water bottles, and just sat for a while, listening to the stream and wind. I reached the area I'd marked for camp a little before dusk. It was a small clearing near an old logging road, flat and tucked between ridgelines. I set up the tent, made a small fire with fallen branches, and ate some trail mix and a bag of dried beef. The night was cold and still. I heard a few owls and maybe a coyote far off. Slept hard and deep. The second day started fine. I broke camp early and kept moving, wanting to cover more ground and maybe even finish the loop ahead of schedule. I knew the unmaintained trail would get rougher, but I didn't expect how quickly the forest would start to take over. After a few miles, the path became less clear. The underbrush got thicker. Deadfall blocked parts of the route, and I had to climb over or bushwhack around them. I checked my map often and used landmarks, stream bends, small hills, rock outcrops to stay oriented. There were no blazes, but I knew how to find my way. Still, the going was slow. Around mid-afternoon, I hit a spot where the trail just seemed to vanish. 1 minute I was on a faint path, the next I was standing in thick brush and uneven forest floor. I spent over an hour crisscrossing the area, trying to pick up the route again. I eventually realized I'd overshot a fork that followed a narrow ridge line. I backtracked and finally found it. Barely more than a deer trail, half covered in moss and roots. By then I was behind schedule. I didn't want to risk hiking in the dark, so I picked up my pace. The ridge trail was tight, with steep drops on one side and thick woods on the other. My legs were burning from the climbs. I barely stopped to eat, just shoved a few dried apricots in my mouth and kept going. I figured I'd find a place to camp around 6. But 6 came and went, and the land didn't flatten out. Just more ridges, more dense brush. I kept telling myself that the topo map showed a valley with a creek not far ahead, where I could camp. I pushed through brambles, scratched up my hands and arms, and kept moving. By the time I finally reached the bottom of the valley, it was nearly dark. The creek was there, shallow and clear. I dropped my pack, drenched in sweat and exhausted. I didn't bother with a fire, just set up the tent on a patch of flat ground near the water. My body ached all over. I forced down a granola bar and some water, changed into dry clothes, and crawled into the sleeping bag. That night didn't feel the same as the first. Couldn't sleep. I kept waking up to every sound outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the creek gurgling. I told myself it was just animals, wind, the normal night sounds of the forest. But something felt off. I felt off, like I was being watched. I didn't want to admit it, but I lay there, eyes open, gripping the handle of my knife in the dark. Eventually I must have fallen asleep, but it wasn't good rest. I woke up groggy and sore, a dull headache behind my eyes. It was colder, too, a sharp kind of cold that cut through layers. I packed up quickly and didn't even eat breakfast. I wanted to get moving. That third day is when things started to go bad. I tried to follow the creek upstream, expecting to hit the main trail within a couple of miles. But the terrain was worse than I expected. The banks were steep and muddy. I slipped twice and dunked one of my boots in the water. My sock was soaked. I stopped to wring it out, then pushed on. After an hour or two, I realized I should have hit the main trail. I checked the map again. Either I was reading it wrong or I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. I climbed a nearby slope to get a better view. From the top, I could see trees stretching in every direction. No sign of a trail, road, or anything else. I sat down and tried to calm myself. I wasn't lost. I just needed to retrace my steps. I took a bearing with my compass, oriented the map, and started back down. But everything started to look the same. The creek branched off into smaller streams. The forest got denser. I started second-guessing every turn. Every boulder and log looked like the last. By late afternoon, I had to admit I was lost. The light was fading again. I set up camp earlier this time, in a dry patch between two large trees. I didn't have much of an appetite, just drank water and tried to think clearly. My phone was still off and I didn't want to turn it on yet. I wanted to save the battery in case I really needed it. I kept telling myself I'd find my way out tomorrow. That night was worse. Something walked near my tent. I heard the crunch of dry leaves, slow, careful steps. I lay frozen in my bag, holding my breath. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours, just staring at the tent wall, every muscle tense. The next morning, I turned my phone on. No signal. I tried climbing another ridge to get higher, but still nothing. The phone said it was 10% battery. I shut it off again. I spent that whole day wandering. I didn't even try to follow the map anymore. Just kept moving, hoping to find a road, a trail marker, anything. I shouted a few times, but my voice just echoed back through the trees. My water filter was starting to clog. I drank less. I was sweating and shaky. That night, I didn't even set up the tent. I curled up in my sleeping bag under a ledge of rock. I was too tired. I started thinking about things. If I died out here, how long it would take anyone to find me, if they ever would. I thought about my parents, my sister, my old dog. I thought about all the stuff I said I'd do but never did. The fourth day, I woke up with stomach cramps, probably from bad water. I felt weak, dizzy. I stumbled down a slope and nearly broke my ankle on a hidden route. I started crying, not from pain, just from everything. From being alone, from being afraid, from feeling stupid. Around midday, I heard something, a sound that wasn't the wind or birds or water. A low drone, faint but steady. I followed it. It got louder. After maybe 20 minutes, I broke through a stand of trees and saw it. A power line. Thin metal towers stretching through the forest. I nearly collapsed. I knew that power lines meant roads, towns, people. I followed the line for miles, stumbling, slipping, barely able to walk. Eventually, I saw a dirt service road. I followed that too. Just before sunset, I came out near a farm. A real house, a driveway, vehicles. I walked straight up the drive and knocked on the door. I didn't even have to explain. The woman who answered saw my face, my dirt-streaked clothes, the scratches and bruises. She brought me in, gave me water, let me use the phone. I called my sister. I cried again. She drove out and picked me up that night. I slept the entire ride home. Took me weeks to stop thinking about that trip. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw trees, heard things that weren't there. I lost 15 pounds. I stopped hiking for months. I got help, started talking to someone about it. The fear, the shame, the feeling of being so small and lost. Eventually, I went back, not to that forest, but to hiking. I learned more, got better gear, stayed on known trails. I never go out without a satellite beacon now. I never let pride get in the way of safety. That trip changed me. It stripped me down to nothing, but I came out of it with something real. A respect for how fast things can turn and how strong I can be when they do. I've always enjoyed hiking, but that trip was different. It wasn't supposed to be. I had done plenty of day hikes before, nothing too intense, just me and the quiet of nature. The thought of getting away from it all, alone with my thoughts, had always seemed like the perfect way to clear my mind. But that day, everything changed. I couldn't have predicted what would happen. Started early like all my hikes. I'd been planning this for weeks. An isolated trail in the foothills, nothing too crazy, just enough to feel like I was escaping the hum of everyday life. I parked at the base of the trailhead, the early morning mist still hanging thick in the air. The sun had just begun to break through the trees, casting a soft, golden light on the wet leaves underfoot. The trail was wide, clearly marked, and I was the only one there. Perfect, I thought. It was the kind of place you could walk for hours without seeing another soul, just how I liked it. I threw on my pack, checked my water bottle, and set off. The air was cool, crisp with the freshness of the forest. My boots crunched on the soft earth, and I found myself slowing down to listen to the rhythm of my steps. For the first hour, it was easy. The trail was simple, a gradual incline leading me deeper into the woods. Birds were chirping somewhere overhead, and the distant sound of a stream trickled through the trees. The leaves were wet, still glistening from the dew, and everything felt damp and alive. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. It was a nice kind of isolation, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world, the kind that clears your head and makes you forget about your worries. But as I continued, the trail began to narrow. The path became uneven, and the ground was steeper, the roots of trees twisting out of the earth like veins. I had to pay more attention to where I placed my feet now, focusing on each step. It was the kind of hike that made you work for it, but I didn't mind. I was used to this kind of terrain. Then the silence changed. The birds seemed to quiet down, and the air felt heavier. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the atmosphere felt off. At first, I dismissed it. It's just nature, I thought. Nature has its moods, but it kept nagging at me. The further I went, the more it felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself that it was nothing. There were no other hikers out here, just me. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I pressed on. Another hour passed, and the path grew even steeper. I was now climbing, my legs burning slightly with the effort. My breathing was heavier, and the trail twisted around rocks and trees, making it harder to see where it led. The mist had dissipated by now, but the air was still thick, and it felt damp against my skin. Every now and then, I'd stop for a breather, sipping from my water bottle, looking out over the valley below. The view was incredible, even if it felt a little eerie. As I rounded a bend, I saw something that made me pause. A pile of rocks stacked neatly, like someone had carefully placed them. I squinted, unsure of what to make of it. It wasn't a cairn, the kind of stack you find to mark a trail. This pile seemed deliberate, as if someone had taken the time to balance each rock just right. It seemed out of place, too precise for the wilderness. I didn't think much of it, though. Could have been some hiker with too much time on their hands, or maybe an animal had dragged the rocks together. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. I moved on, my thoughts starting to wander. Maybe I was just tired. The next section of the trail took me deeper into a thicket of trees. The canopy above blocked out most of the light, making everything feel dim and shadowed. I had to focus now. The trail had become more difficult, and I had to keep my eyes on the ground. The path was nearly gone in places, and I had to step over fallen logs and navigate around dense underbrush. That's when I heard it. A sound that made my heart skip a beat. A snap of a twig, like someone had stepped on it. The noise was faint but distinct. I froze, my pulse quickening. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't. Something about the woods, the silence, made me hesitate. I felt a sudden wave of uncertainty, like maybe I wasn't alone after all. My eyes scanned the trees around me, but there was nothing. I took another step, then another. The sound had stopped, and I convinced myself it was just a squirrel or some other animal. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I kept moving, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My steps were more cautious now, and I began scanning the trees more intently, watching for any sign of movement. I came to a clearing, a small plateau where the trail seemed to stop. There were no more trees here, just a large rock outcropping that jutted out over the valley. It was the perfect spot to take a break and eat something, so I set down my pack and sat on a rock. The view was breathtaking. I could see for miles in every direction, the valley below stretching out, dotted with patches of forest and rocky ridges. It was peaceful, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. As I ate, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone, or something, was watching me. The feeling was growing stronger. It was irrational, I knew that, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. Every sound, every rustle of the wind in the trees, felt like it was a warning. I quickly finished my snack and packed up my things. I didn't stay long at the plateau. I wanted to move on, keep going, get away from this unsettling feeling. As I started back down the trail, the path seemed different somehow. More twisted, more overgrown. It was like I was retracing my steps, but everything felt off. The rocks underfoot seemed unfamiliar. The trees loomed larger, their branches creaking in the wind. The air was colder now, and the quiet had deepened. I tried to reassure myself. It was just my imagination, right? But that's when I heard it again. A rustle of leaves. This time it was much closer. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding. I couldn't see anything. There was no one there. My mind was racing. What was going on? I had to get back to the trailhead. I had to get out of there. I started walking faster, almost running now, trying to get through the woods as quickly as I could. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in around me. Every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing down on me. The weight of the air was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was right behind me, watching, waiting. Then I saw the trailhead ahead, the end of the path, the signpost marking the start of the trail, the familiar, reassuring sight of civilization. My breath was coming in short gasps now, my legs burning from the fast pace, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I reached the end of the trail and stepped out onto the small dirt road where my car was parked. I could finally breathe. The weight that had been pressing down on me lifted, and I felt the tension in my body slowly begin to melt away. My hands were shaking, and I realized just how tightly I had been gripping my pack. It wasn't until I got in the car and started the engine that I looked out the rearview mirror, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just on the edge of the clearing where the trailhead met the forest. It was dark, just a silhouette, but I could see enough to know that it was a person. They were standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel their eyes on me. I didn't stick around to find out who it was. I slammed the car into reverse, pulled away, and drove straight home. I haven't hiked alone since. It was early October when I decided to take a solo hiking trip to decompress. I'd had a rough couple of months, and I needed a break from everything. Work, people, my phone, all of it. I planned a 4-day hike through a stretch of the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas. It wasn't a super popular spot, and that's exactly why I picked it. I wanted quiet, isolation, and time to clear my head. I packed light but smart, just the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, knife, first aid kit, GPS, maps, and backup batteries. I also brought a small notebook to jot down my thoughts. Even though I wasn't much of a journaler, I left early on a Thursday morning, arriving at the trailhead by mid-morning. The weather was cool, and the sky had that soft gray color that comes with fall. I parked, locked up my car, and stepped into the woods. The first day was peaceful. The trail was narrow but clear. Trees with yellowing leaves closed in on both sides, and the forest was quiet except for the occasional bird or crunch of leaves under my boots. I passed a couple of dry creeks and an old, rusted sign that just said West Ridge, 8 miles. I guessed that meant I had 8 miles to my first campsite. I took my time, stopping often to look around or rest. There was no rush. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that gave a great view of the surrounding hills. I found a flat patch of dirt near the edge and set up camp. As the sun dipped below the trees, the wind picked up a little. I sat on a log and ate one of the freeze-dried meals I'd packed, then just sat there staring into the woods. I didn't realize how tense I'd been lately until I felt it start to drain away. That night was uneventful. I slept fine, only waking once when a twig snapped outside my tent. I held my breath for a few seconds, but nothing followed. Probably just a raccoon or a deer. I fell back asleep. The second day, I continued on the trail toward a place called Tallow Creek. According to my map, it ran through a small valley with a spot to camp just on the other side. The trail curved downward most of the day, gradually moving into denser forest. The light barely reached the ground in some places, but I didn't mind it. The quiet was exactly what I needed. Late that afternoon, I reached the creek. It wasn't much, more like a trickle through some rocks, but it was running, and that meant I could refill my bottles. I set up camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the water, surrounded by thick trees and brush. I ate early and lay in my tent as dusk came, just listening. No animals, no wind, just silence. Then, around midnight, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint and rhythmic, like a low thud or thump, and it was coming from somewhere up the creek. At first, I thought it was just water moving against some logs, but the sound was too regular, too paced. I stayed still, listening hard. It went on for maybe 15 minutes, then stopped completely. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I felt tired but pushed on. The trail moved uphill again through more overgrowth. I passed what looked like an old hunting blind, just some wooden boards nailed to a tree and rotting away. Around noon, I stopped to eat and checked the GPS. I was right where I should have been. Everything was going fine, but that afternoon something felt off. It started with a strange smell, faint but sour, like rotting fruit or damp clothes that had been left in a bag too long. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. I didn't see anything, though. Then I started noticing more bones. Small ones, probably from squirrels or rabbits, but too many. More than I usually saw in the woods. Some were picked clean, some still had bits of dried skin. Put me on edge. I kept going a little faster now. The trail started to disappear in places, overgrown with vines and brush. I had to use the GPS to stay on track. A couple times I thought I saw movement in the trees, a flicker of something dark, but every time I stopped, there was nothing. I planned to camp at an old fire tower marked on the map. When I got there, I saw that the tower had collapsed long ago. The metal was twisted and half buried in vines, and the wooden stairs had all rotted away. I didn't want to camp there. Something about the place made my skin crawl, so I kept going until I found a clearing maybe a half-mile past it. That night, I had trouble relaxing. I kept thinking about the bones, that smell, and the sound from the night before. My mind started to wander, filling in blanks. What if someone was living out here? Someone off-grid? Or worse, someone who didn't want to be found? I tried to shake it off. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke again just after 1 a.m. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had that feeling, the one where your gut tells you something's wrong. I listened. Then I heard it. Movement. Slow, deliberate. Leaves crunching. Sticks breaking. It was close. I reached for my knife, staying still. I didn't turn on my light. I just listened. The steps moved around the edge of the clearing, staying just out of sight. Then they stopped. I held my breath for what felt like forever. Finally, I heard them again, this time fading away into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. The fourth morning, I packed up at first light and headed back toward the trailhead. I was done. My plan had been to make a loop, but I cut across a Forest Service road that would shave off about 6 miles. The sooner I got out, the better. But the road was in bad shape, overgrown, washed out in spots. I followed it for hours, watching the sun rise and then move across the sky. Around noon, I started feeling watched again. Every now and then I'd stop and listen. Nothing, but the feeling didn't go away. At one point, I found fresh boot prints. Not mine. They were deep, heavy, and going the same way I was. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out how recent they were. Could have been that morning. The mud was still soft. I moved faster. My pack dug into my shoulders and my legs burned. But I didn't stop. I just wanted out. Around 3 p.m., I saw the roof of my car through the trees. I nearly ran the last quarter mile. When I reached the lot, there were no other cars, just mine. I unlocked it, threw my gear in, and got in. I sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and looking around. Still no one. I drove to the nearest town and got a motel for the night. I took the longest, hottest shower I could stand. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling for a while. My body hurt, but I was grateful to be out. The next morning, I stopped at a diner before heading home. As I sat there eating, I looked over my map again. I traced the trail I'd taken, checking distances. Everything matched up. No wrong turns, no mistakes, but the feeling I'd had out there, that I wasn't alone, still stuck with me. Something had been nearby, watching, maybe following. I'll never know who or what it was, but I've thought about it a lot since. I haven't gone on a solo hike since then. I still love the woods, still go out sometimes, but never alone. Not after that trip. It reminded me that even in a place that seems empty, you're never really alone. And that sometimes the scariest things aren't wild animals or ghosts. They're the people who don't want to be seen. I didn't see anything. No faces. No clear signs. But I know what I felt. And that was enough. I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in early October. The plan was to take a week off from work, drive down to Tennessee, and hike a less popular trail in the Cherokee National Forest. I'd spent most of the year behind a computer screen, barely getting outside, and I felt like I needed a break. I wanted something that would push me physically and mentally. I didn't want crowds or noisy campsites. I just wanted nature, quiet, and maybe some time to think through a few things going on in my life. The trail I picked wasn't completely unknown, but it wasn't popular either. It was a loop trail about 30 miles long, cutting through dense forest, rocky climbs, and some decent elevation changes. From what I read, it could be done in 3 days comfortably, but I gave myself 4 just in case. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, extra food, GPS, and a paper map just to be safe. I had a personal locator beacon too. I wasn't stupid. I started the hike on a Tuesday morning. The trailhead was down a long gravel road that wound through the woods. I parked at a small lot that had room for maybe 5 or 6 cars. There were only 2 other vehicles there when I arrived. It was cloudy, but not cold, and the trees were just starting to show their fall colors. Reds and yellows and a few stubborn greens. I felt excited. Nervous too, but mostly excited. The first day was pretty smooth. The trail was marked with faded orange blazes painted on trees, and I followed them without much trouble. I passed a few streams and climbed a few hills. The woods were quiet, aside from birds and squirrels, and the occasional gust of wind rustling the leaves. I didn't see anyone else all day. I stopped around 4 p.m. to set up camp near a creek. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground under some oaks, filtered water, made dinner, and watched the sky darken. That night was uneventful. I read a little with my headlamp, then fell asleep. No strange sounds, no animals poking around. I woke up once around 2 a.m. to pee, and the forest was dead silent. So quiet it felt like the trees were holding their breath. Day 2 started fine. I broke camp, made oatmeal and coffee, and got moving early. This part of the trail went uphill for several miles. There were long switchbacks cut into the slope, and I could feel my legs burning. The clouds from the day before had cleared, and the sun came through the trees in beams of gold. I remember thinking it was beautiful. Sometime around late morning, I stopped to rest and check the map. That's when I noticed a narrow path splitting off from the main trail. It wasn't marked, but it looked like it had been used before. Maybe a game trail or an old logging road. I thought about following it just to see where it went, but I reminded myself I was alone and far from help. So I stayed on the main trail. That afternoon, I started feeling like something was off. Nothing obvious, just little things. I would walk for what felt like an hour and then realize I hadn't seen a blaze in a while. I'd backtrack a bit and find I had drifted just a little off the path, maybe following a faint animal trail without realizing it. That happened 3 times. Each time I caught it quickly, but it made me feel uneasy, like the forest was pulling me off course on purpose. I shook that thought off. Just tired and not paying attention, I told myself. Around 3 p.m., I came across a clearing. It was maybe 20 yards across, surrounded by tall trees. In the center was a large flat rock, and on the rock was an old fire ring, just blackened stones in a circle. It looked like no one had used it in years. I figured it was a decent place to stop. I dropped my pack and sat on the rock, ate a snack, drank water. It was quiet, but not peaceful. More like the kind of quiet right before a storm. The sky was still clear, but the air felt heavy. I left the clearing after 15 minutes and kept going. That night, I camped in a narrow valley near a dried-up stream bed. It wasn't the best spot, but I was tired and didn't feel like hiking further. I set up, ate dinner, and crawled into my tent as the sky turned dark. That night was not quiet. I woke up to the sound of something walking near my tent. It wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. The steps were slow and irregular, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I held my breath and listened. It circled the tent once. I grabbed my headlamp but didn't turn it on. I just lay there, heart pounding, trying to make out the sound. After a few minutes, it walked away. I didn't hear it again, but I didn't sleep much after that. When morning came, I packed up fast. I looked around the area, but I didn't see tracks or anything unusual. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog, maybe a deer, but it hadn't sounded like any deer I'd ever heard. I kept moving. The third day was rough. The trail climbed steeply through a section of thick pine forest. The ground was soft and the light barely came through. The pines grew close together, and the air smelled like sap and wet bark. I slipped several times on damp needles and had to catch myself on trunks. My legs were tired, and I kept stumbling. Sometime after noon, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in a long time. I stopped and checked the GPS. No signal. I pulled out the paper map, but I couldn't tell exactly where I was. The terrain didn't match up with what I expected. I decided to backtrack. After a while, I found a blaze, but it was faded and looked different than the ones I had seen earlier. More like a red than orange. I followed it anyway, not sure what else to do. That's when I came to another clearing. This one was larger, and in the center stood a wooden structure. It was old, maybe an old trail shelter or hunting blind. The roof had collapsed and one wall was missing. I didn't go near it. I don't know why. Something about it made my skin crawl. It just felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I kept walking faster now. I tried to get my bearings, but the forest looked the same in every direction. Pines and shadows and dead needles underfoot. I felt a rising panic. I stopped and forced myself to breathe slowly, to think. I had food. I had water. I had shelter. I wasn't injured. I just needed to find the trail again. I turned around to retrace my steps, but after a few minutes, I was back at the same clearing. The collapsed shelter stood in front of me like it had moved to block my way. My hands started to shake. I took a long drink of water and sat down. I needed to think clearly. I stayed there until the light started to fade. I knew I couldn't wander in the dark. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, as far from the shelter as I could. I didn't cook dinner. I just ate a cold protein bar and lay in my sleeping bag, waiting for morning. That night, I heard something again. Not walking this time, breathing. It was faint but close, like someone exhaling slowly just outside the tent wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I lay there for hours, sweating and listening. It never touched the tent, never spoke, just breathed. Eventually, the sound faded. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I woke up to weak light coming through the nylon. I packed up in record time and left that place. I picked a direction and walked. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted out. I walked all day, stopping only to drink and eat. Around mid-afternoon, I found a dirt road. Not a trail, a road. It wasn't on my map, but it was clear and wide. I followed it downhill, hoping it led somewhere. After an hour, I saw a small wooden sign. It was nailed to a tree and said Service Road 14A. I didn't know where that was, but it meant I was in an area used by park staff or hunters. I kept walking. Just before sunset, I heard an engine. Pickup came around the bend, and I flagged it down. The driver was a Forest Service worker, and he looked surprised to see me. I explained I had gotten turned around on the trail and asked where we were. He said I was more than 10 miles from the main loop trail, way off course. He gave me a ride back to the trailhead. My car was still there, untouched. I thanked him and sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I never figured out what happened out there. I wasn't hallucinating. I didn't eat anything weird or drink bad water. I still think about the collapsed shelter and the breathing. It was real. I know it was, but I also know people get lost. Panic does weird things to your brain. Maybe I imagined some of it. Maybe not. But I haven't gone hiking alone since, and I never will again. It started with a need to get away from everything for a while. My job had been stressing me out for months, and the city noise felt like it was permanently embedded in my head. So I took a week off, packed my gear, and drove out to a remote national forest in Montana that I'd read about online. It wasn't a well-known park, just a huge patch of wilderness with very few marked trails and even fewer people. That's what I wanted. Silence, space, no people, no emails, just trees, dirt, and sky. I parked my truck at the edge of a narrow dirt road. It had taken me almost 7 hours to get there, and my back was sore from the drive. The sun was already dipping low, so I decided to sleep in the back of the truck that first night. The cold bit into me harder than I expected, but I had brought enough layers. I ate a quick meal, climbed into my sleeping bag, and passed out to the sound of wind moving through pine trees. The next morning, I loaded my pack. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, first aid kit, compass, knife, bear spray. Everything was accounted for. I strapped on my boots, locked up the truck, and headed east into the trees. My plan was simple. Hike in for 2 days, make camp by a river I saw on the topo map, stay there for a night or two, then loop back. It was supposed to be about 30 miles round trip, depending on how the terrain went. The trail wasn't maintained, more of a faded game trail, but I had experience with off-trail hiking. I felt good, confident. The first few hours were peaceful. Birds were chirping, and the sun came through the trees in patches. I passed a few deer and even spotted a moose standing half hidden in a meadow. The trail rose and fell gently, and I made decent time. Around noon, I stopped on a ridge for lunch. From there, I could see the hills rolling out in front of me like waves. No buildings, no roads, nothing but forest. I remember feeling small, but in a good way, like I was where I belonged for a while. By late afternoon, the forest started to change. The trees grew tighter together, and the light dimmed even though it wasn't close to evening yet. The air grew cooler. I noticed more fallen logs and thicker underbrush. Slowed me down, but not too badly. I kept moving forward, following a shallow creek that my map said would take me close to the river. I didn't see much wildlife anymore, just the occasional squirrel or bird. It got quiet, but I didn't think much of it. I figured I was just deeper into the woods. I made camp before sunset on a small flat patch near the creek. The water was icy cold but clear, and I filled my bottle and boiled some for dinner. After eating, I sat back against a tree and listened. Nothing, not even the creek, made much noise, just the occasional crack from a branch far off. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, convinced I'd heard something outside the tent. A snap of a twig, a shuffle. Once I thought I heard breathing. I opened the tent and looked around with my headlamp, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. The next morning I woke up feeling off. Not sick, just tense, like I was being watched. I shook it off, packed up, and continued east. The trail faded more the farther I went. At some points, I had to rely on the map and compass completely. I kept moving though, keeping the creek on my left. Around midday, I reached a steep ravine that wasn't marked on the map. The earth had collapsed sometime recently, probably due to rain or snowmelt, and I had to climb down carefully and then pull myself up the other side. It took me an hour to get across what looked like a 100-yard gap. On the other side, the woods were different again. The trees were older, thicker, and the ground was covered in layers of fallen branches and rotting leaves. The air smelled sour, like mildew and decay. I didn't like it, but I was too far in to turn around now. I pushed on until just before dark and made camp again. That night was worse. I definitely heard footsteps outside my tent. Not animal ones, slow, deliberate steps. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped right outside the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for the knife. I just waited, heart pounding. After a few minutes, the sound moved away. I don't think I slept at all that night. The next morning, I was done. I packed up fast and decided to head back. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I backtracked to the ravine, but when I got there, something was wrong. I couldn't find the exact place I had crossed. The walls looked steeper and the far side looked different. I walked up and down the edge for almost an hour trying to find my way, but nothing looked familiar. Eventually, I picked a spot that looked passable and tried to climb down. Halfway down, the ground under me gave out. I slipped and tumbled hard, hitting rocks and roots. My pack cushioned some of it, but I landed badly. My ankle twisted with a sick pop, and pain shot through me like lightning. I lay there for a while, trying not to panic. When I finally tried to stand, my leg wouldn't hold my weight. I had to crawl up the opposite side, dragging my pack and gritting my teeth. It took everything I had to get to the top. By then, I knew I was in real trouble. Couldn't walk. Not properly. My ankle was swelling fast, and I still had at least 10 miles to go, maybe more. I wrapped it as best I could and made myself a crutch from a thick branch. It helped a little, but every step was slow and painful. That night, I set up camp in a hurry. I didn't bother eating. I just drank some water, took some ibuprofen, and lay down. The footsteps came again. Slower this time. Closer. I kept the knife in my hand. I didn't sleep. The next few days blurred together. I moved as fast as I could, following the creek back west. I barely ate. My leg got worse, not better. The pain was constant, and I started feeling weak. I ran out of painkillers. Then I ran out of food. My map was useless by then. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. Trees all looked the same. Landmarks I remembered didn't show up. Once, I thought I saw a trail marker, but it turned out to be just a patch of moss on a tree. Then it started raining. Cold, hard rain that soaked everything I had. My boots were wet for 3 days straight. I stopped setting up the tent and just curled up under my poncho. I was always cold, always wet, always hungry. My ankle throbbed like it was full of fire. I started hearing things. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but never saw anything. I didn't know if I was being followed or if I was just losing it. I remember one night where I thought I heard someone calling out, but the voice was wrong. Too quiet, too slow. It didn't sound human. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. It had to be. Then, finally, I saw something that gave me hope. An old logging road. Barely visible, but it was flat and open. I followed it. I limped down it for what felt like forever. And then I saw a fence. Wire strung between posts. Beyond that, a dirt road. I nearly cried. I crawled under the fence and dragged myself onto the road. A couple in a pickup found me a few hours later. I was sitting in the rain, soaked and shaking, too tired to move anymore. They loaded me in the truck and drove me to a small clinic in a nearby town. I had a bad sprain, mild frostbite, and was severely dehydrated. They kept me there for 2 days before I could make the drive back home. I still think about that hike. I think about how easy it is to get lost, how fast things can turn. I went in looking for peace and got something else entirely. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I only know that I came out alive, and that's more than I could have hoped for by the end. I haven't gone hiking alone since then. I still go out, but always with someone, always on marked trails, always with a GPS. That forest taught me something real. Not about ghosts or monsters, but about how thin the line is between control and chaos. About how nature doesn't care what you want. It just is. And next time, I'll respect that from the start. I planned a solo hiking trip in mid-September, something I'd wanted to do for years. I had a few days off work. The kids were staying with their grandparents, and my wife encouraged me to take the time to clear my head. I chose a trail in northern Montana, far from towns and people. It wasn't one of the popular ones. I found it on a blog by some guy who hiked mostly off-grid routes. He'd mentioned this one as being rarely used, with old fire watchtowers and stretches where you wouldn't see another soul for days. That sounded perfect. I packed everything I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, 2 water filters, food for a week, bear spray, first aid kit, and my GPS. I had backup maps printed out and stored in a waterproof bag. I tested my gear the night before I left. Everything worked. I had no real nerves, just a strange mix of excitement and the kind of focus you get before doing something serious. The trailhead was at the end of a long gravel road. The last 30 minutes of the drive were rough, full of potholes and dips. I parked beside a rusty old sign that barely had lettering left on it. There were no other cars, just trees, hills, and the sound of wind through the branches. I set out just before noon. The first day was uneventful. The air smelled clean, and the forest was mostly pine with patches of aspen. I hiked nearly 10 miles and set up camp in a small clearing beside a cold, narrow creek. I sat on a log and ate a freeze-dried meal while the sun dipped low. The night was quiet. I slept hard. The next day was tougher. The terrain shifted, and I started gaining more elevation. There were switchbacks that made my legs burn, and I had to stop more often. The trail became faint in places, and I had to rely on my map to keep moving in the right direction. Around mid-afternoon, I passed the remains of a fire tower, just like the blog had said. Only the metal skeleton remained. The stairs were gone. I sat under it, drank water, and watched the trees sway. I remember feeling calm. By day 3, I hadn't seen another person since I parked. The forest felt endless. Sometimes the quiet got so thick it made my ears ring. The trail narrowed and curved around ridges that dropped off sharply. I saw bear scat on the trail and kept my bear spray close. At one point, I spotted a black bear far off in a valley, just a shape moving through brush. It didn't notice me. That night, I camped farther from the trail than usual. I'd found a small rise that gave me a view of the hills stretching into the distance. I liked the feeling of space. I cooked some oatmeal and sat watching the stars. I didn't hear anything strange, but I had a hard time falling asleep. I kept rolling over, checking the tent zipper, adjusting my sleeping bag. My heart wouldn't settle. The next morning, something felt different. I'd had this strange dream that I was being followed, but I couldn't see by what. I shook it off. I packed my gear and continued on. I was past the halfway point and planned to take a loop that would eventually bring me back toward my car from a different direction. The trail here was barely visible. It crossed over dry creek beds and through dense underbrush. I kept getting turned around. I had to double back a few times. It was around noon when I noticed something that didn't belong. A piece of fabric, bright blue, hanging from a tree branch about 10 feet off the ground. It looked like part of a jacket or a backpack strap. It was too high to have just blown there by wind. I walked closer and saw it was tied around the branch in a loose knot. That made my stomach clench. Someone had put it there, but why? I looked around for footprints or any sign someone had passed through recently, but the ground was dry and covered in pine needles. I kept going, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every few hundred feet, I stopped to listen. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe someone had come through and marked the trail, but it wasn't a trail marker. There was nothing else like it. A couple hours later, I stopped to refill my water bottles at a stream. As I crouched down, I noticed footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They looked fresh. The tread pattern was different. Bigger boot prints, maybe someone taller than me. They came from upstream and kept going the same way I was heading. I stood up and stared down the trail, but the trees were too thick to see far. I waited a few minutes, trying to hear if anyone was ahead. Nothing. No voices, no rustling. Just wind. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Other hikers used this route, even if it was rare. But I hadn't seen anyone in days, and now this, first the blue cloth, now the prints. I kept going, but I felt like I was being watched. I walked faster than usual, not stopping much. I skipped lunch. By late afternoon, I reached an area that looked familiar from my map. There was supposed to be an old ranger station nearby, just ruins now, according to the blog. I figured I'd camp there for the night and check it out. I found it down in a hollow, the remains of a small cabin, mostly collapsed. The chimney was still standing and part of one wall. Inside were broken boards, rusty hinges, and an old metal stove tipped on its side. I pitched my tent up the hill a bit, near a group of trees. I didn't want to be too close. As I was setting up, I kept glancing toward the trail. Nothing moved, no sounds. Still, I felt exposed. I made a small fire, heated some soup, and ate quickly. Just after sunset, I heard something. Not an animal. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate. I froze and listened. They were coming from the trail. I couldn't see anything, but the steps stopped not far from where the trail curved past the cabin ruins. Then nothing. No movement. I waited in total silence, ears straining. I didn't move for almost 10 minutes. Then I slowly stood and put out my fire. I left everything where it was, my pot, my food bag, and walked quietly toward my tent. I crawled inside and zipped it shut, holding my bear spray in one hand. I lay there, barely breathing. About an hour passed. I didn't hear the steps again, just normal night sounds, crickets, wind, but my nerves were fried. I didn't sleep much. Every twig snap made me sit up. Around 3 a.m., I finally dozed off for maybe an hour. When I woke up, it was light out. I packed quickly. I didn't eat. I wanted to get out of there. I figured if someone was messing with me, I could at least put distance between us. I checked my map and planned a shortcut that would skip part of the loop and cut a day off the hike. It would be harder terrain but would get me back faster. The shortcut was brutal, steep, full of fallen trees and loose rocks. I slipped more than once. At one point, I lost the trail completely and had to bushwhack using my compass and GPS. It started raining around noon, light at first, then heavier. The forest got darker. Everything was wet. I kept moving, soaked through, slipping in mud, heart pounding. Sometime in the afternoon, I reached a ridge and saw a clearing below. I checked the map and confirmed it was a logging road. I knew if I followed it west, it would eventually meet up with the gravel road I'd driven in on. I was relieved. I started down toward it. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw something that stopped me cold. A small lean-to structure made from branches and bark. It was low to the ground, maybe 4 feet tall, just big enough for someone to crawl into. There were animal bones scattered around it. Skulls, ribs, not old ones either, some still had bits of flesh. I backed away slowly. My first thought was that it was a hunter's shelter or maybe a trapper's, but it didn't look right. It wasn't built like a shelter meant to protect you from weather. It looked wrong, more like something made to hide in. And the bones weren't from game animals. I saw a dog skull. I didn't stick around. I got on the road and started walking as fast as I could. I didn't stop until my legs ached. I walked for hours. Eventually, the rain stopped and the sky began to clear. Around dusk, I saw the faded sign for the trailhead up ahead. My car was still there, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I checked into a motel and showered twice. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not for a long time. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe someone who didn't want to be found. I've thought about reporting it, but what would I say? No crime, no proof, just signs. But I know what I saw. I haven't hiked alone since then. I still hike, but always with someone. And never on trails that don't show up on official maps. I'm careful now. I trust my instincts. That trip shook something loose in me. Not fear exactly, just a new understanding. The wilderness isn't empty, and you're not always alone out there. Sometimes something is watching. Started with a simple plan, really. I had just moved to a small town nestled in the foothills, a place surrounded by nature and endless trails. I was craving something simple and peaceful, away from the buzz of the city. I figured a day hike up one of the nearby trails would be a great way to explore the area and clear my mind. The morning was crisp, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. I woke up early, excited to take in the fresh mountain air. The trailhead was only about a 15-minute drive from my place, so I threw on some old sneakers, grabbed my water bottle, and set off. The drive was peaceful, no traffic, and only the occasional deer crossing the road. The town was quiet, too quiet, but in a comforting way. I had lived in cities my whole life, so this still felt a little new to me. When I arrived at the trailhead, there wasn't a soul in sight. The parking lot was empty, which seemed odd for a weekend morning, but I shrugged it off. Maybe everyone else had gone earlier or was headed to a different trail. It didn't matter. I was alone in nature, and that was the goal. The path was narrow and lined with tall pines, their dark green needles swaying gently in the wind. It felt like something from a dream, peaceful, calm, just the sound of my feet crunching on the gravel path. I started to relax, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders with each step. The first mile was easy. It was a steady incline, nothing too challenging. I took my time, snapping a few pictures here and there, admiring the view. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows on the trail, and the air was fresh and cool, just the way I liked it. As I moved further up, the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in around me, the trail narrower, more rugged. At this point, the sound of birdsong was the only thing breaking the silence, and I appreciated how far removed I felt from everything else. But then something changed. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but it felt different. The air seemed heavier, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. A shiver ran down my spine. I chalked it up to nerves. I had always been a bit jumpy when I was by myself in the woods. I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. When I continued, the trail became steeper. Rocks and loose dirt made footing a little tricky, but I kept going. The silence was now almost oppressive. No birds, no insects, just my breathing and the sound of my feet on the uneven ground. The forest grew darker as I ascended, the trees blocking more of the light. I reached a point where the trail split. One path seemed to lead toward a clearing, while the other veered deeper into the woods. I didn't think much of it and decided to take the one less traveled, figuring it would lead to a more scenic overlook. As I moved along the path, I noticed the silence was complete now. No wind, no birds, nothing. I felt a small knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach, but I pushed on. It wasn't like I had much of a choice. There were no other paths, no other way back. The trees grew denser, and I could hear my own breath echoing in the stillness. The trail was harder to follow now. I had to step over fallen logs, navigate through thick underbrush, and the ground was wet from the last rainfall. Despite the discomfort, I kept moving forward, hoping that I would reach the top soon. After a while, the trail began to wind around a hill, and I thought I saw something up ahead, a faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through the trees. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't sunlight at all. It was something else, a reflection of sorts. I wasn't sure what it was, but it gave me pause. I stopped dead in my tracks and stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. There, half covered in moss and tangled vines, was an old, rusted metal object. It looked like part of an old vehicle, maybe a car or truck, completely out of place in the middle of the woods. I didn't know what to make of it. It was clearly abandoned, but who would leave something like that out here? My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I noticed a strange odor in the air, something musty, like rotting wood. When I got closer, I could see more details. The vehicle, or what was left of it, was barely recognizable, crushed in places, with its windows shattered and covered in grime. But what really made my skin crawl was the unmistakable shape of something tied to the rusted frame. It was hard to tell what it was, just a bundle of something dark and twisted. My stomach churned as I stepped back, my heart racing. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I could feel my pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. I turned around quickly, my foot slipping on the wet ground as I made my way back toward the main trail. The quiet was suffocating now, the air thick with an unease that I couldn't shake. I hurried back to the split in the trail, my mind racing. I told myself that I was just overreacting, that it was probably just an old, forgotten relic, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had felt off about the whole situation. When I reached the split in the trail again, I took the path that led to the clearing. The sky had grown darker, the clouds thickening overhead, and the wind had picked up. I quickened my pace, hoping that the clearing would offer some sense of relief. But as I pushed through the dense underbrush, something caught my eye movement. In the corner of my vision, I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it was tall, impossibly still. My first instinct was to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. For a long moment, I stood there, unable to take my eyes off the figure. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. I snapped out of it, forcing myself to turn and start running. I didn't care anymore about the trail or the views. I just needed to get out. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the feeling of being watched, followed, crept up my spine like ice. The trail back down was a blur, each step faster than the last. I didn't stop, didn't look back. My thoughts were scattered, my mind racing with what I had just seen, and more importantly, what I hadn't seen. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was breathless, drenched in sweat, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The air was still, the trees as quiet as ever. But the feeling that had been gnawing at me since I first set foot on the trail never left. I got into my car quickly, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, but the hum of the motor was a small comfort. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The trailhead was still empty. I never went back to that trail. I don't know what I saw that day, and I'm not sure I want to know. But I do know this. Sometimes the wilderness is more than just trees and rocks. Sometimes it holds secrets you aren't meant to find. I had been hiking alone for about 3 hours when I noticed the sky beginning to shift. I had been planning this solo trip for months, picking the perfect trail. Remote, challenging, and a place I could get lost in my thoughts for a while. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the trail was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant sound of a bird calling. The path was narrow, winding through thick forest, the ground uneven with roots jutting out and rocks scattered along the way. It was an overcast day, and the clouds hung heavy in the sky, making the forest darker than usual. Normally, I would have turned back by now, knowing how quickly the weather could change. But today, I felt different. Maybe it was the solitude, or maybe it was the way the trail seemed to pull me in deeper. Whatever it was, I pushed on, convinced I'd make it to the summit before dark. The path was getting steeper, and the trees began to thin out as I climbed higher. I stopped briefly to catch my breath and take a swig from my water bottle. The silence around me felt strange, almost unnatural. There wasn't the usual buzz of insects, no birds flitting through the trees, just an eerie calm. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The air was thinner up here, and the higher you go, the quieter it gets. I continued climbing, my boots crunching against the gravel and loose dirt, my legs burning with the effort. It had been a while since I'd hiked this intensely, but I had trained for it. Still, my body was telling me to slow down. I ignored it, knowing I was almost there. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and I paused to take in the view. The forest stretched out below me, endless trees broken only by the distant peaks of other mountains. The wind had picked up a little, the trees swaying gently. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something strange. At the edge of the clearing, there was a rock formation, one I hadn't seen on the map. It was an odd, almost unnatural shape with smooth, rounded edges. As I stared at it, I realized it wasn't just a rock. It was something man-made, or at least altered by human hands. The markings on the surface were faint, worn down by time, but still visible. The rocks seemed out of place here, surrounded by the wild, untamed forest. I couldn't explain why, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. It was just a rock, I told myself, just something that didn't match the natural surroundings. I stepped closer, my curiosity getting the better of me. As I touched the surface, I felt a strange warmth radiating from it, despite the chill in the air. I pulled my hand back, uneasy, and decided it was time to move on. But as I turned to leave the clearing, something caught my eye. A trail of footprints, faint and barely visible, leading into the forest. They were odd, too large to be animal tracks, but not quite the right size for a human. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to push the thought from my mind. It was probably just a trick of the light, or an animal I hadn't seen properly. Still, my gut told me to stay alert. I followed the prints for a while, the trail winding deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, the underbrush thickening, making the path more difficult to navigate. It was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the leaves. Felt wrong. The further I went, the more disoriented I became. The trail had begun to loop back on itself, twisting in unnatural ways. I had been following the prints for over an hour now, but they seemed to disappear into the thick brush, only to reappear farther ahead. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to pull me deeper. I reached a small clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, a small, dilapidated structure, its windows boarded up and the roof caved in. It looked abandoned, yet there was something unsettling about it. The air around it felt stagnant, as if it had been untouched for years. I knew I should turn back. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't help myself. I approached the cabin, my footsteps muffled by the soft dirt beneath me. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange pressure building in my chest. Something was wrong with this place, I was sure of it. I reached the door and pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the otherwise silent woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. The floor was covered in debris, old furniture, broken glass, and papers scattered everywhere. I stepped further inside, trying to make sense of the place. There were no signs of life, no footprints or fresh disturbances. It was as if the cabin had been forgotten, left to decay alone in the woods. But then I found it, a small, faded photograph pinned to the wall. I pulled it down, my fingers trembling as I examined it. It was a black and white photo of a group of people, 4 men and a woman. They were standing in front of the cabin, smiling, their faces youthful and happy. But what caught my attention was the date written on the back, 1974. Something about that date didn't sit right with me. It was too long ago, yet everything in the cabin looked as though it had been left recently. My mind raced, trying to piece things together. Why would someone leave all this behind? And why hadn't anyone come looking for the people in the photo? I turned to leave, but something stopped me. There was a noise, faint at first, but growing louder. A soft scratching sound, like something dragging along the floor. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't alone. I quickly spun around, my eyes darting across the room. Nothing. I was alone. I stood still for a moment, listening. The sound stopped. My mind told me it was just the wind or the creaking of the old house. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I decided to leave. As I stepped back toward the door, I froze. Something was blocking my way. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it clearly. A figure, standing just outside the doorway. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, my pulse racing. I couldn't make out any details at first, but then the figure moved closer, just enough for me to see. It was a man, tall and thin, with a weathered face and an unsettling expression. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a chill like nothing I'd ever felt before. I didn't wait to find out who he was. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the clearing with the strange rock formation. My legs were burning, my chest heaving with each breath, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew I had to get out of there. The feeling of being watched never left me as I made my way down the mountain, the trail twisting and turning, but never fast enough to escape the feeling that someone, or something, was still following me. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the light was fading. I was exhausted, my muscles aching, and my mind was spinning with questions. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I was never going back to that cabin. Whatever happened there, whatever was waiting for me in those woods, I had barely escaped it, and I wasn't going to risk finding out what it was. As I reached my car and got inside, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The mountain stood dark and still in the distance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, and I wasn't the only one who knew it. I had been hiking for years, mostly solo. I found peace in the woods, in the quiet, in the hard breathing and sore muscles that came with the long miles. It was the only time I really felt like I could breathe. I was 38 at the time, working from home, mostly alone. I had no kids, no spouse. Hiking became my escape. It gave structure to my weekends, especially when I planned a big trip. That summer, I decided to challenge myself with a 3-day loop in a remote section of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I had done parts of the trail before, but never the full loop. The loop was about 32 miles, with a good mix of ridges, valleys, rocky stretches, and thick woods. It was a bit off the beaten path, not overly maintained, and that's what I liked. I planned it carefully, studied maps, saved GPS coordinates, packed 3 days of food, brought a power bank, and left a note with a friend about where I'd be. Cell reception would be spotty at best. The forecast was dry, low 80s in the day, high 50s at night, perfect conditions. I started on a Friday morning. My car was the only one at the small gravel pull-off where the trailhead began. That always gave me a bit of a thrill, being totally alone out there. The first day was beautiful. The trail followed a ridge for several miles. I passed through sections of pine forest where the needles were so thick underfoot it was like walking on sponge. I saw deer, a few snakes, and heard what I thought was a bobcat scream way off in the distance. It all felt normal. I made it about 11 miles before I stopped for the night, setting up camp in a small clearing near a dry creek bed. It took some work to find a flat spot without rocks under my tent. I ate jerky, a protein bar, and some trail mix for dinner. I boiled water I had collected from a small spring earlier and filled both bottles. As the sun set, the woods got real quiet. That's one thing I always noticed on solo trips: the quiet gets thick. Your ears start picking up every little sound, and even a squirrel stepping on dry leaves can spike your heart rate. The first night was uneventful. I had a little trouble sleeping, like I always do the first night. My body had to adjust to the ground and to the sounds outside. I woke up twice to the sound of something walking near the tent, slow steps, but it turned out to be a raccoon. I heard it sniffing around and scratching at my bear canister for a few minutes before it gave up. I kept my food sealed up and away from camp, so I wasn't too worried. The second day was where things started to shift. The trail dove down into a dense part of the forest. Lots of underbrush, barely any light. The trees were packed close together, and I had to duck under a lot of fallen limbs. I started seeing fewer blazes on trees. I kept checking my GPS to stay on course. Around midday, I came across a small, overgrown trail branching off to the left. It wasn't marked on my map, and it didn't look like anyone had been on it for a while. I kept going straight. A few miles later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker for over an hour. That got me nervous. I checked my GPS again. It showed I was just a little off the trail, maybe a few hundred feet. But when I tried to bushwhack back to the right spot, I couldn't find anything. I started walking in wider and wider circles, hoping to hit the trail again. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. I tried to stay calm. I pulled out my compass and used my last known direction to try to backtrack. After an hour, I finally found what looked like a worn path. It was faint, but it had footprints in the mud, recent ones. Relief washed over me. I followed it. That trail led into an area that felt different. The air was still. The woods got darker, denser, and quieter than before. I couldn't hear birds anymore, not even the wind. That might sound strange, but when you spend enough time in the woods, you notice these things. I tried telling myself it was just thicker forest. I followed the trail for over an hour, hoping it would rejoin the main loop. At one point, I saw something off to the side, an old piece of clothing. It looked like a shredded jacket sleeve, mostly buried in dirt and leaves. I didn't want to touch it. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out how old it was. The fabric was faded and ripped. There were no signs of animals around, no bones, nothing else. I took a photo of it and kept walking. I kept going until I hit a small clearing. There was something off about it. The trees were pulled back in a perfect circle, almost unnaturally even. The grass was dead in the center. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't want to step into it. I felt exposed. I skirted the edge and kept moving. About a mile later, I came across a small, abandoned structure. It was hidden by vines and brush, low to the ground, looked like an old hunting blind or maybe a tiny shack. The door was missing. Inside was dark, full of debris, buckets, rusted tools, moldy tarps. I didn't stay long. I made camp that night on a slope overlooking a dry gulch. I couldn't find a flat spot anywhere else. I barely ate. I was tired, but restless. I kept thinking about that jacket sleeve and the weird clearing. My nerves were shot. That night, I heard movement in the woods again. Slow steps, heavier than a raccoon. I sat up, heart racing, clutching my knife. The steps came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Then they stopped completely. I didn't sleep much. The third morning, I packed up fast and got moving early. I had enough food and water to finish the loop, assuming I was even still on it. My GPS wasn't helping anymore. The tree canopy was thick, and my signal kept dropping. Around noon, I found what looked like the main trail again. The blazes were faded, but they matched the color from the first day. I kept pushing forward. Then I heard it, something crashing through the brush behind me. Not running, but not moving slow either. I stopped and listened. Whatever it was, it stopped too. I moved. It moved. I kept this going for about 15 minutes. I tried to stay calm, told myself it was a deer or a bear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was following me. I finally turned off the trail, hiked up a steep slope, and hid behind a rock outcropping. I waited there for almost an hour. Nothing came by, no sounds at all, just silence. I kept going, hiking harder, trying to get out of the woods before dark. My feet were killing me, and my water was almost gone. Finally, around 6 in the evening, I saw it. A sign nailed to a tree. It was the same trailhead marker from the beginning. I had made a full loop somehow. I wanted to cry. My car was still there, untouched. When I got home, I went through my GPS logs. They didn't make sense. There were parts of the track that looped in impossible ways, places where I knew I was walking straight. I emailed the Forest Service about the old structure and the clearing. They said no structures were listed in that area. They thanked me for the report. That was it. I never went back to that trail. I still hike, but I stick to well-known areas now. Places with people. I carry an emergency beacon now too. I don't talk about that trip much. Not because I'm scared of what people will think. It's because I still don't understand what happened, and that's what scares me the most. Everything I saw out there could be explained: animals, old trash, lost trails. But it didn't feel right. The way the forest swallowed sound, the way the paths disappeared, the way I lost all sense of time and direction. It didn't feel like I was just lost. It felt like something wanted me to stay lost. But I didn't. I made it out. I made it home. And now I hike smarter. I pay attention to that gut feeling when something doesn't feel right. That trip taught me that nature doesn't care if you're prepared. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't have to be supernatural to be dangerous. Sometimes, being alone in the woods is scary enough all by itself. It was just supposed to be a simple hike, a way to get some fresh air and escape the noise of everyday life. I had always enjoyed hiking, even if I didn't do it as often as I wanted. So, when I saw the weather forecast for a clear day, I packed my backpack and drove out to a trailhead a little over an hour from home. I wasn't entirely familiar with the area, but it seemed popular enough. The trail was marked, well-maintained, and there were signs at the start indicating its length. A few hikers had already arrived when I did, but they all went their separate ways once we hit the trail. The kind of quiet, peaceful day that you'd expect. The kind of solitude I craved. The trail wound through a dense forest at first, the tall trees providing a welcome shade. I could hear the occasional bird call, the rustling of leaves in the wind, and the distant sound of water from a nearby stream. The air was crisp, and I could taste the freshness of it on my tongue as I made my way along the dirt path. First, everything seemed perfect. The kind of perfect you don't realize you're experiencing until it's gone. I had been walking for about an hour when I noticed the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone else hiking, but there was no one. The trail stretched behind me, empty. I shrugged it off as my mind playing tricks. I had been hiking alone for some time, and I was probably just getting too caught up in my thoughts. I kept walking. The trail began to climb gently as it followed the contours of the land. I could feel my muscles warming as I moved, but it was nothing too strenuous. The trees thinned out a bit as the path veered toward the edge of a small ridge, and the view opened up in front of me. I could see down into a valley, the creek winding through the valley floor like a silver ribbon. I stopped to take a quick drink of water and snapped a photo of the view with my phone. As I was standing there, the air shifted. The breeze that had been so refreshing earlier became colder, and it carried a scent of damp earth and something off. I couldn't quite place it. That was when I heard the crunch of leaves again, this time much closer. My pulse quickened, but when I turned around, no one was there. The trail behind me was still empty. I scanned the area around me, my eyes sweeping through the trees, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no signs of anyone nearby. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was just on edge. I'd read about people getting spooked in the woods for no reason. My logical side told me it was just a coincidence, that it was probably just an animal moving through the brush. A deer, a squirrel, anything. But as I continued up the trail, the feeling that something was wrong stayed with me. The air seemed heavier now, and the further I went, the more isolated the surroundings felt. The forest was dense, and the path began to narrow. I glanced at my phone, no service. It wasn't a surprise. I was far enough out that I knew there wouldn't be any signal. I pressed on. The forest closed in around me, and the silence was almost suffocating. The trail became steeper, and the footing was uneven. My heart pounded harder as I worked my way up, my steps growing more labored with each passing minute. I reached a spot where the trail seemed to split, a fork leading off to the right. I hesitated. The map I had with me didn't show a fork in the trail. My instincts screamed that I should turn back, but I convinced myself to keep going. It was probably a minor detour, just an extension of the path I was already on. I took the right fork. As soon as I turned onto the new path, the atmosphere seemed to change. It wasn't just that the trail felt more remote. It was the way the air felt heavier, the kind of heavy that makes your skin tingle. The trees seemed to crowd in on me, their limbs stretching overhead like grasping fingers. The ground beneath my boots became softer, muddier, as though the earth itself didn't want me to pass. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard faint sounds, snapping twigs, rustling leaves, but when I looked around, there was no one there, just the wind and the forest. Eventually, the path opened up to a small clearing. It was more of an overgrown patch of ground, with tall grass and shrubs. At the far side of the clearing, there was something strange. A small wooden structure that hadn't been on the trail map. It looked old, abandoned. A shack, maybe. There were no signs of life, but the place felt off. I walked toward it, drawn by curiosity. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped just short of entering the clearing, standing at the edge where the grass met the dirt path. That's when I noticed it, footprints. Fresh footprints in the dirt. The shoes looked large, and the prints were deep, like someone had been here not long ago. My stomach sank. This wasn't a place people came often, not unless they knew about it. The fact that someone else had been here recently, I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't want to find out. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it again, those footsteps. Only now they were much closer, too close. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there. The trail was empty, the clearing silent again. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced. Should I go back the way I came? The path had been narrow, and it was hard to retrace my steps in a place so thick with trees. Maybe I could take a shortcut through the woods to get back to the main trail. But what if the person I had heard wasn't alone? Panic started to rise in my chest. I had no way of knowing who or what was out there. I had no weapons, no way to defend myself. And it was getting late. The shadows were already stretching long across the ground, the daylight beginning to fade. I made my decision. I turned and ran, hoping to reach the main trail before night fully set in. The air was thick with the sounds of my footsteps, the brush scratching at my legs as I pushed through the undergrowth. My heart raced, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The path seemed longer now, as though the forest had grown impossibly vast and twisted. I was losing my bearings, my mind clouded with fear and the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I stumbled and fell once, scraping my knee on the rough ground. The pain barely registered. All I could think about was getting out of there, getting back to civilization. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I emerged from the woods and back onto the main trail. The relief was instant. I was back on familiar ground, and I could hear the sounds of other hikers in the distance. It wasn't until I saw a family coming toward me that I slowed down, my breaths ragged and shallow. I didn't stop to explain or tell them about what I'd experienced. I didn't need to. I just kept walking, pushing forward, not looking back. The sounds of the forest seemed less menacing now, the daylight almost gone. The trail wound back down the hill toward the parking lot, where my car awaited. I was safe. I had made it out. But even now, when I think back on that day, I wonder about those footprints, about the strange shack, the feeling of being watched. I never did go back to that part of the trail, and I don't think I ever will. Some places are better left alone, and some things are better left unexplored. The woods are full of secrets, and I was lucky enough to escape the ones that almost got me. It was supposed to be a simple hike, one of those typical weekend escapes where I could unwind from the stress of work and just breathe. I was used to hiking, so nothing about this seemed out of the ordinary. I had been to these woods before, though not on the trail I was planning to take today. The weather was perfect, just cool enough to make it comfortable but not too chilly. The sun hung in the sky, not quite setting yet but not too high either. I set out early, a little before noon. The trailhead wasn't far from the parking lot. It was an old, worn path, a bit overgrown, and the woods felt quiet. Too quiet, but I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for the woods to feel this way, especially during the middle of the day when most people were either working or at home. There was a calmness to it which I usually found comforting. The trail was narrow, twisting, and turning through thick trees. I liked the sense of isolation it gave me. Being out in nature felt like a relief from the constant buzz of city life. The air smelled of fresh pine and damp earth. Birds called from the treetops, and every now and then, I could hear the distant rustle of an animal in the underbrush. It was peaceful. I hiked on, following the trail deeper into the forest. There was a stream I planned to pass, a quiet little spot where I could sit for a while and rest. I'd been there before. It was a good place to catch my breath, have a snack, and just watch the water trickle over the rocks. It was about an hour into the hike when I came across the stream, just like I remembered it. The water was low, running clear, and the rocks were smooth beneath the surface. The sun was brighter here, filtering through the trees and casting shadows that danced along the ground. I stopped, taking off my backpack, and sat down on a large rock by the water. I opened my water bottle and took a long drink, feeling the coolness slide down my throat. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the sound of the water and watching the ripples spread out. The whole thing felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I didn't notice anything strange at first. The peacefulness of the place had always made it seem almost otherworldly, as if time slowed down here. I ate a snack, wiped my hands, and checked my watch. An hour had passed. I was starting to think about turning back when I heard something. It wasn't a bird or an animal this time. It was a sound in the distance, deeper in the woods. A low, throaty sound, almost like a cough. I stood up immediately, thinking it might be a person, but the noise didn't repeat. I listened carefully. For a while, everything was silent again. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it had been the wind. I packed up my things and started back down the trail, retracing my steps. But that's when I started feeling uneasy. The woods felt different now. Not in a supernatural way, but more like something was just off. It was hard to describe, but the feeling stayed with me. The rustling in the trees had become more frequent, and I noticed a strange heaviness to the air. The birds had stopped calling. I kept walking, trying to push the feeling aside. Maybe I was just overthinking it, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. As I walked further, the trail seemed to stretch longer than I remembered. I'd been on this path before, but now it looked unfamiliar. The trees felt denser, the underbrush thicker. The sun, which had been shining brightly before, seemed to be hidden behind clouds, casting everything in a dull, gray light. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but it felt like hours. I reached another fork in the trail. This wasn't here before. I stared at it for a moment, trying to decide which way to go. I didn't remember the split in the path, and it left me feeling even more uncertain. At that moment, I heard it again. The low, throaty sound. It was closer this time, almost like it was coming from the woods just off to my right. My heart started to race. I wasn't alone out here. I stood still for a while, straining my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. The forest was silent again. I was getting anxious now. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail since I started, and the feeling of isolation was pressing in on me. I chose to go right, taking the path that seemed to lead me back toward the main trail. But as I walked, I started to notice more signs that something was wrong. The trees were growing closer together, their branches intertwining above me, blocking out most of the light. The air had grown heavy, like it was thick with something I couldn't see. Then I heard something else, a crackling sound, like someone walking through the underbrush behind me. My heart thudded in my chest. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The trail was empty. I kept walking, faster now, trying to keep my composure. The rustling behind me didn't stop, though. It followed me, staying just out of sight. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I saw nothing, but I felt eyes on me, like I was being watched. The trail started to descend, and I could hear the sound of a distant river. That was familiar, a good sign that I was headed back toward where I had started. But the feeling of being followed didn't go away. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I couldn't shake the fear creeping up my spine. The crackling noise was louder now, and I broke into a jog. My breath quickened as I picked up speed, desperate to get back to the parking lot. But the farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The trail had changed. It didn't look the same anymore, and I couldn't remember where I had come from. I reached a steep incline, one I hadn't seen before, but I kept going. I was almost at a run now, my feet stumbling over rocks and roots. I was convinced something was behind me, following me, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. The trees began to thin, and I could see light ahead. The trail was opening up. My heart raced even faster, the sound of my pounding footsteps filling my ears. When I finally broke through the trees, I was back at the clearing where the parking lot should have been. But it wasn't. The parking lot was gone. I stumbled to a stop, my chest heaving. The area I was standing in looked completely unfamiliar. There was nothing but empty forest ahead of me. I turned around, looking back the way I came, but the trail was gone. I had no idea how I'd gotten here, or how to get back. The path I had followed was lost to me. For a moment, panic gripped me. The realization hit hard that I had no way out. The world around me felt wrong, like the forest had shifted, and I had no idea how. I had been so sure of my path, but now I was lost, completely lost. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to think. Then I remembered the trail I had taken earlier. It had been long, but it had eventually led me to the stream. Maybe if I retraced my steps from there, I could find my way back. So, I turned around and began walking again, slower now, trying to calm my racing heart. I focused on the sound of my feet crunching over the leaves, the way the wind moved through the trees. The woods didn't feel as heavy anymore, but the quiet was still unnerving. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon the stream again. There it was, just as I had left it. I followed the stream for a while, hoping it would lead me out, but after what seemed like an eternity, I finally saw something familiar. There was the trailhead in the distance, the parking lot just beyond it. It was a relief like no other. As I reached the parking lot, I felt a sense of overwhelming exhaustion. I wasn't sure how much time had passed or how far I'd walked, but I was finally back. I got into my car, started the engine, and left the forest behind me. The events of that day stayed with me, lingering in my mind. But I made it out. I was safe. I set out on the trail with no real sense of urgency. The air was cool, the trees tall and dense, a typical forest trail winding through the hills like it had for years. I'd been here before many times, but today felt different. There was something heavier in the air, a quiet that had a sense of foreboding to it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had planned this hike for weeks, and I wasn't about to let my mind play tricks on me. The day started like most others. I woke early, packed my gear, water, snacks, a first aid kit, my trusty compass, and a map of the trail. I made sure everything was in its place. I didn't expect to be out too long, just a day trip to stretch my legs and enjoy some fresh air. It was a good idea. I needed the break, needed to clear my head. Lately, life had felt like it was suffocating me, and I was hoping the quiet of the woods would do its usual trick. The first couple of miles went by easily. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to walk, but that's what I liked about it. There weren't many people around. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call high above. I paused at a small creek to take a drink, listening to the water flow over smooth rocks. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, the fragrance that always made me feel at home. But then, something shifted. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Maybe it was the absence of birdsong, the way the breeze stopped moving for a few seconds too long. I looked around, the hair on the back of my neck rising, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. A small group of trees clustered together, casting long shadows as the sun began to climb higher. A bird flew by, its wings cutting through the air, and for a moment I was reassured that nothing had changed. But that uneasy feeling lingered. I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing. A few more miles, a few more twists and turns, and I'd reach the peak. The view would be worth it. It always was. As I walked, my footsteps grew louder in my ears, my breath more deliberate. I could feel my mind wandering again, like it always did on these hikes, away from the distractions of the world. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard it, a rustling just off the trail, a faint snap of a twig. I froze. My heart jumped in my chest. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and that sound, something was wrong. I stood still for a long moment, scanning the trees around me, but I saw nothing. No movement, no creature stepping out from the thicket. It could have been anything. An animal, a branch breaking under the weight of something, or perhaps the wind had finally come back to life. Still, the unease crept back. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something felt off. I decided to move forward. Maybe I was just being paranoid, I thought, but my pace quickened. My thoughts were racing, and every snap of a twig or crack of a branch made my heart beat harder. Every rustle in the leaves made my skin crawl. The trail narrowed and the trees grew denser. The canopy above blocked out more of the sky, and the world felt smaller. The uneasy feeling was no longer a background hum. It was front and center, filling my mind with a dozen possibilities of what could be lurking just out of sight. I came to a clearing, a spot where the trail veered to the left and led toward a steep hill. I'd been here before, but something about it looked different today. The rocks that used to line the path were scattered now, displaced as if something heavy had moved through. The grass at the edge of the clearing had been trampled, flattened in patches like something or someone had passed through recently. It wasn't much, just little signs, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. I stopped for a moment to take a deep breath, trying to calm the gnawing sensation growing inside me. The air was still, thick with the scent of earth and moss. I tried to listen for any sounds of movement, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, harsh in my ears. I turned left, following the trail up the hill. It was steeper than I remembered, the climb more difficult than it had been before. The trail narrowed further, and the trees pressed closer. I kept my focus on the ground, trying to keep my mind occupied, but it wasn't working. My thoughts kept drifting back to the rustling sound, to the way the air had felt so thick, like it was holding something back. I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting just around the corner. And then I heard it again, the rustling. This time it was closer, a branch snapping under something heavy. My heart rate spiked. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed. I couldn't tell from where the sound was coming, but it was close enough now that I couldn't ignore it. Something was moving just beyond the trees. I couldn't stand still any longer. My legs were trembling, but I forced them to move. I had to get to the top of the hill. I had to keep going. I pushed myself harder, breathing faster, each step more urgent than the last. At the top of the hill, I stumbled into a small plateau. The view was as breathtaking as it always was. The landscape spread out below me. Rolling hills, distant mountains, and the river that wound like a silver thread through the valley. But this time, the beauty of it didn't soothe me. It only made the weight in my chest heavier. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I turned around, scanning the area behind me, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the underbrush. There was nothing, no one, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. And then I saw it, a flash of movement, something large, dark, and fast. It darted behind a tree just out of sight, but I'd seen enough. It was big, too big for a deer, too quick for a bear. My mind raced, but I didn't have time to figure it out. I had to move, and fast. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I just ran, pushing through the brush, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The path was more uneven now, rocks and roots hidden under the thick carpet of leaves. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled, my knees slamming into the ground. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I had to get back to the trailhead. I had to get out of the woods. The sound of something following me made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There was something heavier behind me. Footsteps, deliberate and fast. I couldn't hear them clearly, but I knew they were there. I was being chased. I didn't dare look behind me. I just ran. The trail was a blur. My mind was a blur. The only thing I could focus on was the pounding of my heart and the burning in my legs. I ran through the trees, ducked under branches, pushed past rocks and roots, and still whatever was behind me kept gaining. I could hear it closer now, almost at my heels. Suddenly, the ground under me gave way. I fell, tumbling down a slope, my body crashing into rocks and dirt. I gasped for air, pain shooting through my arms and legs as I hit the ground hard. For a moment, I just lay there, stunned, my breath coming in short gasps. I could feel the earth vibrating beneath me as something heavy moved above. I pushed myself to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My heart pounded in my chest, but I had no choice but to keep going. I was almost at the bottom of the slope, almost there. I stumbled to the trail and finally looked back. There was nothing, no one. The forest was still. I stood there for a long moment, my chest heaving, the fear still gripping me. What had been chasing me? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I just knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, faster now, my legs carrying me as quickly as they could. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, breathless and shaken. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. The forest was quiet now, but I knew it wouldn't be for long. I made it back to my car, locked the door, and sat there for a long time, just staring at the forest. The woods were still, but whatever had been out there, whatever had been following me, was still in there too. And I didn't plan on ever going back to find out what it was. I set out on the hike early in the morning, long before the sun had fully climbed over the mountains. The air was cool, crisp and fresh, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of birds and the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful hike, a chance to clear my mind after weeks of stress at work. I had chosen a less popular trail, something that wouldn't be crowded, a quiet escape into nature. The trail I was on had been recommended by a friend who had hiked it last summer. He spoke highly of the views and the solitude, but as I made my way through the dense trees and winding paths, I realized that I was almost completely alone. There were no other hikers in sight, no sign of anyone ahead or behind, just the trail stretching ahead of me, bordered by thick forest on both sides. It was a comfortable isolation, a chance to be alone with my thoughts. The path narrowed as I climbed higher, and I felt the muscles in my legs start to burn as I trudged up the incline. By mid-morning, the trail had become steeper and the forest thicker. The trees were massive, their trunks covered in thick, mossy bark. The scent of pine was heavy in the air, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, covered in layers of fallen needles and leaves. The sunlight barely pierced the canopy above, creating a soft, dappled effect on the ground. Despite the beauty of the landscape, I started to feel a sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't a fear of the forest itself. Nothing about the woods seemed unnatural or threatening, but more a feeling of being watched, as if I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I shook off the sensation, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks. I'd been hiking alone before many times, and nothing had ever happened, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow following me. Every now and then, I thought I heard something moving in the trees, twigs snapping, branches shifting, but when I stopped and listened closely, there was nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves. I pushed forward, telling myself that the sounds were nothing more than the usual life of the forest, the subtle noises that you can never quite place. Around noon, I reached a small clearing. The trees parted just enough to allow a view of the valley below, with its rolling hills and distant peaks. I paused to catch my breath and took in the view, appreciating the quiet beauty of the landscape. I pulled out my water bottle and took a long drink, feeling the cool liquid refresh me as I stared out at the valley. It was peaceful here, and for a brief moment, I felt at ease. But then, I noticed something strange. In the distance, on the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was just a deer, maybe a bear, though I wasn't sure. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out the details clearly, but the figure seemed out of place. It was standing still, almost too still, as if it were waiting for something. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the figure remained motionless, hidden partly by the trees. My heart started to beat faster as I stared at it, unsure of what I was seeing. After a few moments, the figure seemed to step back into the trees, disappearing from view. I held my breath, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a large animal that had caught my attention from a distance. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I checked the trail behind me, but there was no one, just the same empty path I had walked on. I shook my head, telling myself to stop being paranoid, and turned back toward the trail to continue my hike. The feeling didn't go away, though. As I moved deeper into the forest, the sounds around me seemed amplified. The crunch of my boots against the ground sounded louder than usual, and I could hear the rustling of the trees as the wind picked up. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. It was as if the forest itself were alive, shifting and moving just out of sight. The trail twisted and turned, the path narrowing in places until it became little more than a thin, overgrown track. The trees were so thick here that they blocked out much of the light, and the air felt heavy, damp with the moisture of the forest. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I realized I hadn't seen any signs of wildlife for a while, not even birds. The silence was unnerving. Then I heard it, a low, distant sound, like something large crashing through the underbrush. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was something heavy, deliberate, and moving fast. My pulse quickened as I stopped in my tracks, trying to listen. The sound faded, but it left behind a lingering sense of discomfort. I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the trees around me. But there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anything. Just the quiet hum of the forest. I decided it was best to keep moving. Maybe I had imagined the sound. Maybe it had been an animal, something I hadn't seen. But as I continued, the unease grew. The forest felt more oppressive, the trees closing in on me. The path ahead seemed darker, and I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking just out of view. It wasn't until the late afternoon that I realized how far I had gone. The trail had taken me deeper into the forest than I had intended, and the sunlight was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the path. I wasn't worried yet. There was still plenty of daylight, but I knew I needed to start heading back soon. I glanced at my watch, noting the time. It had been a longer hike than I'd planned for, but it didn't seem like a big deal. Then the sound came again. This time it was closer. A heavy, deliberate thump came from somewhere behind me, just beyond the trees. I froze, heart racing. I couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. It was something large moving toward me. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. I stood there, trying to listen, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, there was another crash, closer this time, just off the path to my right. I snapped my head in that direction, but again, nothing. No movement, no animal, no person. Just the rustling of leaves in the wind. I knew I couldn't stay here, not with whatever was moving in the woods around me. I had to get out and fast. I turned and started to walk briskly down the path, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The air seemed thicker now, heavier, as if the forest itself were closing in on me. My breath came in short, rapid bursts, and my legs felt like lead. The path seemed endless, stretching out in front of me, yet every step felt wrong, like I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel the presence of something, just out of sight, following me, watching me. I pushed forward, my pace quickening to a near jog, but every now and then, I would hear a thump, a snap, a crack, and I would freeze, holding my breath, hoping that whatever it was hadn't noticed me. But each time, the sounds faded away, and I would continue, the knot in my stomach tightening with each step. By the time I finally reached the clearing again, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. The light had changed. The forest no longer felt welcoming, no longer felt like the peaceful escape I had sought. The unease had turned into full-blown fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment. I didn't stop in the clearing this time. I kept moving, heading back down the trail toward the parking lot. The forest was darker now, and the sounds of the woods seemed louder, more ominous. I could still hear the occasional thump, the heavy crash of something large moving through the underbrush, but I didn't dare look. My legs were screaming with fatigue, but I pushed on, ignoring the pain, the exhaustion, the fear. When I finally emerged from the trees and saw the parking lot in the distance, I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept walking until I reached my car, got inside, and locked the door behind me. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm myself down. The quiet of the parking lot felt like a relief, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I didn't want to, because I still didn't fully understand it myself. But what I did know was that I had been followed, not by an animal or some random person, but something else, something I couldn't explain. I haven't gone back to that trail, and every time I think about it, I feel that same knot in my stomach. But the strangest thing is that there was nothing. Nothing I could point to, nothing concrete, nothing I could say for sure. Just a feeling. And sometimes, I wonder if I was just imagining it all. I hadn't planned to hike today. The weather wasn't perfect. Clouds hanging low over the mountain peaks. A stiff breeze making the trees sway. But I needed the fresh air. It had been a long week, filled with work that felt like it would never end. So, when Saturday morning came and I found myself awake earlier than expected, I grabbed my gear and headed out. The trail I chose was the one I'd hiked a few times before. It wasn't particularly long, but it went through a part of the forest that I'd always found peaceful. I'd seen some deer there once, and the stream nearby was calm, its water reflecting the canopy of trees above. Nothing dangerous, nothing that could go wrong, or so I thought. The air was cool as I made my way to the base of the trail. I was wearing a jacket which felt good against the early morning chill, and I had my boots on, the ones that had seen plenty of miles. The trail started off easy, winding through the trees, the path clear and well-trodden. A gentle incline brought me deeper into the forest. I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves, the occasional bird call in the distance, but there was something oddly quiet about it all. The usual hum of life that you'd expect from a forest seemed muffled, almost as if it were holding its breath. Maybe it was the clouds or the way the light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows that made the forest feel a bit more closed in. I pushed forward, my feet crunching on the dirt beneath me. The trail grew steeper, and I found myself concentrating more on each step. The forest around me felt different than it had on past hikes. Not in a way I could explain, but the silence was heavy, and the air was thick. As I moved further, I began to notice the lack of other hikers. Normally, I'd pass a few people on the trail, even on a quiet Saturday, but there was no one, not a single soul. It was odd. I checked the time, and it wasn't too late, just around 9 a.m. Maybe everyone had decided to stay inside because of the weather, but something about being alone in the forest made my stomach twist slightly. Still, I kept walking, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The trail took a sharp turn to the left, leading me along a ridge that overlooked a valley. Below me, I could see the tops of more trees, stretching out into the distance. It was beautiful, despite the ominous clouds overhead. I stopped to take a few deep breaths and enjoy the view, but something caught my eye. Movement down in the valley. First, I thought it was a deer, but the movement was too erratic, too fast. I watched for a moment longer, squinting, trying to make out what it was. It was just barely visible through the trees, but I could see a figure moving swiftly through the underbrush, just on the edge of the valley. I couldn't make out details, but it looked like a person, or at least the shape of one. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I questioned whether I had actually seen anything at all. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. A bird chirped somewhere in the distance, but nothing else seemed to stir. Shaking off the feeling, I took another step forward, pushing the thought out of my head. Maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, the mind tends to wander when you're alone in the woods for long enough. But as I continued down the trail, the strange feeling didn't leave. It lingered, crawling under my skin. The path ahead of me started to narrow, and the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above, blocking out more light. I slowed my pace, aware of how the atmosphere seemed to shift the deeper I went. The air was heavier now, and the ground was damp from last night's rain. It was a different kind of silence here, one that felt unnatural, like the forest was holding something back, keeping it hidden. That's when I heard it, the faintest rustle of leaves, like something, or someone, was moving just off the path to my left. My body tensed, and I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound stopped as quickly as it had started, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped forward cautiously, glancing around, trying to see if there was anyone or anything nearby. But the trees were thick, the underbrush dense. There was no sign of anything unusual, no obvious trail that someone could have taken. Still, the feeling didn't go away. I kept moving, albeit more cautiously now. I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind or an animal, but my senses were on high alert. Every crunch of a twig beneath my boots sounded too loud, every movement in the trees too noticeable. My heartbeat quickened, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Minutes passed like this, each one dragging on as I made my way deeper into the woods. The trail was becoming more difficult to follow, the path overgrown in places, the rocks slippery from the rain. I was beginning to question whether I should turn back, but something kept me going. I wasn't sure what. Maybe I thought I'd find an interesting view or a cool spot I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit that I was starting to feel unnerved by the stillness, by the isolation. Then, ahead, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure standing at the side of the trail. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. He was dressed in a thick jacket, his back to me, standing motionless. For a moment, I considered calling out, but something told me not to. He was still, like he was waiting for something or someone. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My instincts told me to turn around, to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I took a few slow steps forward, watching the figure closely. The man didn't move. He was positioned just enough in the shadows for me to wonder if I was seeing things. Maybe he was just another hiker and I was overreacting. But as I drew closer, I noticed something that made my heart race. His arms hung limp at his sides. His posture was too stiff, too unnatural. It looked like he wasn't just standing there. He was frozen. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back. The feeling of unease that had been building since the valley rushed over me in full force. Something was very wrong. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just another hiker. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the whole forest was waiting for something to happen. And that's when I heard it. The snap of a twig, clear and loud behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There, in the shadows of the trees, I saw another figure moving toward me, slowly, methodically. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a random hiker or someone taking the same trail. I needed to get out, fast. I turned and bolted, not looking back. The sounds of footsteps followed me, close, too close. As I raced through the woods, the underbrush scratching at my legs. I had no idea where the trail was anymore. The trees blurred together as panic set in. I could hear them behind me, moving just as quickly, but I refused to stop. My breath came in short gasps as I pushed through the forest, trying to find some way out, any way out. The trail had vanished, and I was running blind, stumbling over rocks and roots. I felt my body tire, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away from them, from whoever they were. And then, just as my legs began to give out, I saw it. The clearing ahead, the open space where the trail curved back toward the parking lot. I pushed harder, sprinting toward the light, toward safety. I burst into the clearing, my chest heaving, my legs burning. The figures didn't follow. I looked around, frantically, but the forest was quiet again. I was alone, shaken. I finally stopped and turned, watching the trees. There was no sign of them, nothing. Took me a long time to gather my thoughts enough to leave. But when I did, I never looked back. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than just a couple of hikers on the same trail. When I reached the parking lot, I didn't hesitate. I jumped in my car and drove home, my mind replaying everything over and over. What had I seen? Who were they? I'll never know, but I'm not going back to those woods. I've always loved the quiet that comes with being deep in the woods. That kind of silence you only get when you've gone far enough away from roads, phones, and people. I've done a lot of solo hiking over the years, mostly in the Midwest and the Appalachian area, and never had a problem. I carried everything I needed. I read maps well. I checked weather patterns obsessively, and I always left a plan with someone. I didn't consider myself careless. I just liked being alone out there. This trip was supposed to be a 4-day out-and-back hike in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. It was the second week of September. The leaves just starting to change, temperatures still mild during the day and cool at night. I picked a less popular section, part of a trail I hadn't done before, one that looped deep through some old, less trafficked terrain. I had no real reason for picking that route except that it looked quiet on the topographic map and seemed like it would be good for solitude. I parked my truck at a gravel pull-off early that Monday morning, locked it up, checked my GPS, and loaded my pack. I had a full 4-liter bladder of water, a filter, 3.5 days of food, 2 knives, a medical kit, my headlamp, an emergency beacon, and all the basics. My phone still had some service, but I expected to lose that not far in. I clicked my watch to start recording the hike and stepped onto the trail just after sunrise. The first day was quiet and beautiful. The trail was overgrown in spots, but not hard to follow. I walked for several hours through pine and hardwood forest, stepping over roots and the occasional fallen tree, hearing nothing but birds and squirrels. I passed one abandoned hunting stand, rusted and half-rotten, nailed into a dead tree, and thought about how long it must have been since anyone had hunted out here. I made camp that night near a slow-moving creek. I'd covered about 12 miles, a little more than planned, but I felt good. I pitched my tent on a flat patch under some fir trees and cooked rice and beans on my little stove. It was fully dark by the time I finished, and I zipped myself in with a book and read for a while before falling asleep to the sound of crickets and trickling water. The second day was when things started to feel a little off. I woke up early, broke down camp, ate a cold granola bar, and kept walking. The terrain got rougher as the trail climbed into more remote country, steeper inclines and narrow ridgelines with thick brush. Around midday, I noticed something strange. The trail was still visible, but it didn't match what was on my printed map. There was supposed to be a sharp turn east after a rocky clearing, but instead the path kept going straight. At first I thought I'd misread the map, but after double-checking my GPS and compass, it looked like the trail itself had been rerouted at some point, or maybe washed out and reformed naturally. It wasn't totally uncommon. Old trails fade, new ones form. Still, it put me about 2 miles off my intended path. I adjusted my plan, decided I'd follow this new track eastward and try to intersect the original route farther along. It seemed simple enough at the time, but by the afternoon, it became clear that this trail was barely a game path. There were no blazes, no signs, no recent footprints. It was wild. Every few minutes I'd have to stop and push aside thorny branches or detour around patches of thick undergrowth. The slope started climbing again. I remember sweating a lot even though the temperature wasn't hot. My shirt stuck to me and the flies were bad in the still air. I passed a ridge full of loose shale, and that's when I twisted my ankle. It wasn't a full sprain, but I felt something pop a little. I dropped to the ground and sat there for a few minutes, feeling my heart thump as the pain pulsed through my foot. I laced my boot tighter and tested it out. I could walk, but not without pain. I thought about turning around, but I was already well past halfway to where the loop was supposed to connect again. I figured I'd just camp early and rest it. I set up camp that evening in a small hollow surrounded by mossy rocks. There was no water source nearby, so I rationed what I had left. I wasn't too worried. I had the filter, and the map showed another stream 2 miles ahead. But as I lay in the tent that night, I felt uneasy. I couldn't place why exactly. Maybe it was just being more isolated than usual. Or maybe it was the pain in my ankle that throbbed every time I shifted positions. But it was the kind of feeling that makes you check your zipper twice and sit up straight at every sound outside the nylon walls. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking I heard movement, but every time I unzipped the tent and looked, it was nothing, just wind, branches, small animals. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me into the next morning. On day 3, I packed up and kept moving, slower now, using a stick I'd carved into a makeshift walking stick. I was trying to reconnect with the main trail. I kept expecting to find it just over the next ridge or around the next bend, but it never came. At some point, I realized I wasn't just off track. I was completely off any maintained trail at all. What I thought was a path had faded into nothing. There were no signs of hikers, no trash, no footprints, no anything. Just endless forest, steep slopes, and deadfall. By mid-morning, I started conserving water. My map said the stream should have been nearby, but either I was too far off or it had dried up. The sun was getting hotter overhead, and I was sweating more than usual again. My legs ached from the terrain. My ankle felt worse. I had to keep stopping to rest and check my direction. Around early afternoon, I heard something. Not an animal, something man-made. A low metallic clanging, rhythmic and distant. I froze and listened. It stopped. I waited. Then it came again. for quick clangs, then silence. I couldn't tell which direction it came from. It bounced strangely off the trees. I turned my head, heart suddenly racing. It sounded like someone hitting metal with a hammer, maybe, then nothing. Dead quiet again. I yelled once, hoping someone would answer. Nothing, just birds in the far distance. I moved toward the sound, but it never came back. After another half hour of climbing and pushing through brush, I gave up and changed course again, aiming due west in hopes of hitting the logging road that should have run parallel to this section. My plan now was just to get back to any kind of road or fire trail, then follow it back to my truck, even if it meant sleeping one more night in the woods. That evening, I found something. A cabin. Not a house. A proper log hunting cabin, old, weathered, tucked behind a line of thick pine trees. No sign of people, no smoke, no light. The roof looked intact, the walls were gray and green with moss, and the front porch was half collapsed. I circled it slowly, calling out once, but got no reply. The door was cracked open. Inside it was dark and cold. I stepped in slowly. It was empty. No furniture, just dust, a broken cot, and rusted hooks on the wall. An old stove sat in one corner, soot black. It looked abandoned for decades. I stayed inside only long enough to rest in the shade and drink a little more water. There were claw marks on the door frame, probably a bear, and holes in the floorboards. I didn't feel safe there. I moved on. I camped that night near a cluster of boulders. It was cold. I only had a few sips of water left. I lay awake most of the night again, listening. Something rustled near the rocks after midnight, slow, crunching footsteps. I stayed still, holding my breath, knife clutched tight in my hand. The steps passed nearby and faded. I didn't look. I didn't want to know what it was. I left at first light. The fourth day was the hardest. I was dehydrated, my ankle was swelling, and my legs barely had energy. I couldn't tell if I was walking in circles. I stopped checking the GPS, the battery had died, and focused only on the compass and elevation lines on the map. I tried to keep heading west, but the hills and gullies forced me off course again and again. Around midday, I fell. A steep slope of loose rock gave out under me, and I slid 10 feet down, tearing my shirt and ripping the skin on my arm and thigh. I sat at the bottom and cried, the kind of cry that comes when your body has nothing left, and your mind starts wondering if you're going to die out there. But I didn't die. Not yet. I pulled myself up and kept going, hour after hour. At one point, I thought I saw something red through the trees. I turned toward it. It was a marker, an actual blaze, red paint on bark. I almost didn't believe it. I followed it. Then another. Then another. By late afternoon, I stumbled out onto a narrow fire road. I dropped to my knees and laughed. I didn't know where it led, but it was something. I followed it for miles. Just before sundown, I saw tire tracks in the dirt, then a rusted gate, then pavement. A pickup truck came by about an hour later, and I flagged it down with both arms raised. The man inside gave me water and drove me 10 miles to a ranger station. I had lost 12 pounds. I was covered in cuts and bug bites, sunburnt and limping, but I was alive. Later, I found out that the section of trail I'd followed had been decommissioned 5 years ago due to erosion and dangerous conditions. The cabin I saw had belonged to a trapper who vanished in the night. I'm not the kind of person who takes risks for fun. I've always liked hiking, but I never pushed past what I could handle. I stuck to trails I knew or ones I had researched carefully. I liked the quiet, the feeling of being out in the middle of nowhere, away from phones and people. It helped me clear my head. I never went unprepared, and I always let someone know where I was headed. That's what made what happened so strange, because everything that followed started on a hike I thought I had totally under control. It was early fall, just the start of October. The leaves were starting to turn that deep orange and red, and the air had cooled down enough to make hiking comfortable. I had taken some time off work, and I planned a solo hiking trip in western North Carolina around the Nantahala National Forest. I had been there before, but never this deep into the backcountry. I was aiming to hike a loop that would take about 3 days if I paced myself right. I packed accordingly: light tent, freeze-dried meals, water filter, first aid kit, bear spray, map, compass, the whole deal. I had my GPS tracker and left the coordinates and route plan with my friend back home. The first day started out great. The trail was quiet but beautiful, winding through deep forest with only the sound of the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I hiked for about 7 hours, stopping every so often to drink water and rest. I reached a nice flat clearing by a stream around late afternoon and decided to make camp there. I set up my tent, cooked a simple meal, and sat by the stream until the sun went down. It was peaceful. That night I slept hard. When I woke up early the next morning, the forest was covered in a heavy fog. It wasn't unusual for this area, especially in the fall. I packed up and got back on the trail. The fog was thick, and everything felt a little muffled. The trees were dripping, and my boots were already damp by the time I had gone a mile. I followed the trail uphill for a while, and somewhere around midday, I got the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious. The trail hadn't disappeared or anything, but I started to notice little things. The trees looked a bit different. The incline felt steeper than the topo map showed, and I hadn't passed a few of the landmarks I had marked. I stopped and checked my compass. It said I was going north, which matched the route. Still, something didn't sit right. I kept going for another couple of hours, hoping I'd come across a sign or anything that confirmed I was still on track. But instead, the trail started to narrow. It wasn't a full trail anymore. It looked more like a worn animal path. I checked my GPS tracker, but it wouldn't connect to the satellites. That wasn't good. I pulled out my map and tried to figure out where I could have gone wrong. But with the fog and trees, I couldn't see far enough to orient myself properly. I backtracked, or at least I thought I did. I turned around and tried to follow the same path I came in on, looking for the same rocks and fallen branches I remembered. But they weren't there. That's when I started to worry. I'd never been lost before, not really. But this didn't feel right. I kept moving. I didn't want to panic. I remembered all the advice. Don't run, don't yell, don't go downhill unless you know there's a road. Stay calm. I found a small clearing and sat down to eat and rest. I thought about staying there until the GPS worked again, but I didn't want to waste daylight. I knew the sun set faster in the forest, and I didn't want to be moving in the dark. That second night, I made camp in a spot that was less ideal. I was on a slope and the ground was wet. I boiled water from a puddle using my filter and ate another freeze-dried meal. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises, branches cracking, rustling in the underbrush, probably animals. But every time I started to doze, I jolted awake again, thinking I heard footsteps or breathing. I gripped the bear spray in one hand and my knife in the other under my sleeping bag. In the morning, the fog was gone. The sun was out, and I felt a little better. I packed up and kept moving. I figured if I was off trail, I needed to find a high point where I could try to get a signal or at least spot a landmark. I hiked uphill for hours. The brush was thick, and I had to push through branches and thorny plants. My arms were scratched, and my pants were torn in places. I started to get that desperate feeling like I was walking in circles. At one point, I found a tree with a faded red marking. It looked old, like it hadn't been touched in years, but it meant someone had been through here at some point. I followed the direction the mark seemed to point. The terrain got worse, steeper, rockier, and the forest darker. It started to feel like no one had been here in a long time. I lost track of time. My water was running low, and I hadn't seen a stream all day. My throat was dry, and my legs ached. I kept going uphill, thinking maybe I'd find a ridge. Just before sunset, I found a spot with a partial view through the trees. I could barely make out distant hills. No roads, no cabins. Nothing familiar. I set up camp again. That night was worse. I heard something walking near the tent. Not just walking, circling. The ground crunching, slow steps. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag, holding my knife. I didn't breathe. Whatever it was didn't leave for a long time. When it finally did, I couldn't sleep after that. I waited for morning, counting the seconds. The next day, I ran out of food. I had one protein bar left. I rationed it, but I knew I needed to find water soon. I headed downhill this time, figuring most water flows that way. My legs were weak, and I started getting dizzy. I felt lightheaded every time I stopped. I slipped once and hit my elbow hard against a rock. It started to swell up. I didn't know if it was broken, but it hurt bad enough that I couldn't bend it. Late in the afternoon, I finally found a stream. I dropped to my knees and drank straight from it, not even caring about filtering it. I filled my bottle and rested for a long time. I wanted to follow the stream, thinking maybe it would lead to a road or a larger body of water. That's when I saw something that almost made me cry. A crushed plastic bottle. Someone else had been here. I followed the stream until nightfall, then made camp again. This time, I built a small fire with damp wood and a fire starter. It smoked more than it burned, but it made me feel a little safer. I didn't hear any animals that night. The next morning, I kept following the stream. It widened into a shallow creek. I saw more trash, an old granola wrapper, a rusted soda can. Then I spotted tire tracks. Faint, but there. I followed them until I hit a dirt road. I walked that road for hours. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't care. I just kept walking. My feet were blistered, my muscles ached, and my throat was dry again. But I didn't stop. Eventually, I heard a sound that didn't belong in the forest. A truck engine. I stood in the middle of the road, waving both arms until it stopped. The man who drove it didn't ask many questions. He gave me water, let me sit in the back of his truck, and drove me to the nearest ranger station. I was about 15 miles off course. They said the trail I was on must have washed out or been overgrown, and I had gotten turned around in the fog. I stayed the night at a cheap motel and went home the next day. I didn't hike for a long time after that. Even now, I triple-check maps and don't go anywhere that doesn't have cell service. I never figured out what was circling my tent that night or why my GPS wouldn't connect for 2 days. But I know I was lucky. If I hadn't found that stream, or if the man in the truck hadn't come by, I don't know if I would have made it out. I still love the forest, but now I understand how fast things can go wrong. Nature doesn't care about plans or gear. It doesn't care that you meant to stay on the trail. It just is. And if you're not careful, it'll swallow you whole.